Hello everyone, welcome to episode 42 of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre, with me is Z. Before we start the show, we will be doing another reminder that we are going to be going on a break. May 25th is going to be our last episode, so that is next week, I believe. Yep, I just wanted to double check that. So yeah, next week will be our last episode. We're coming back on September 14th, which is like midway through September. So, we'll be on for a few months just over the summer while we're, working on stuff, but just wanted to let you guys know that in advance. That way you guys don't come here in like 2 weeks and then there's nothing here. So, yeah, we just wanted to get that out of the way. And the next thing we have before that, before we get into any like new news, is actually an update to the story that we covered last week with the Huawei interestingness that we saw. So last week we covered a kernel bug that was super trivial, and it was like a security subsystem. It was really odd because there was a very blatant buffer overflow, and it was a security subsystem. It was called HKSP. So you wanted to say something there, Z?
Well, yeah, this was kind of my update on that, because I made some comments that maybe are true, maybe are not true. It's not clear at this point. GR Security's also kind of updated their posts, but the key thing here is with HKSP, which was the Huawei kernel self-protect system, basically email was sent out on Friday before the last episode with these patches, various security features to basically prevent messing with the kernel, trying to stop some exploits. When we talked about that, I mentioned how it appears that this wasn't somebody from Huawei, that it wasn't actually Huawei sending this out. Instead, it was somebody, and this was in the first line of the GitHub. On the README itself, makes a mention that actually it looks like they might have removed the repository. Oh no, there it is. They just renamed it. But on that first line there, it mentions that that basically they're not from Huawei, or they're not. This was done on personal time. Yeah. So I took that to mean that this person had worked on this, on their own. Whether or not they were with Huawei, they do use Huawei as an organization for their account, but that's just like typed in. It's not an actual like connection to any Huawei corporate account. Despite that, what's kind of come out now is one that the comment actually with that statement saying how they're not actually, how this isn't actually from Huawei. While the commit date for that was on Friday, before they emailed the Linux kernel hardening list, before GR Security did that, like it was in theory in there before that, the actual push event wasn't until Monday morning after the response had already come to the from GR Security and all of that. So basically after people had shot back about the vulnerability in there and just bad coding, then this mysterious commit backdated to Friday was pushed, which definitely kind of leads to a bit of a question as to...
It is pretty suspicious, yeah.
Yeah, it leads kind of to the question of whether or not Huawei is behind and trying to backpedal a bit, or if this is just kind of somebody who genuinely was just working on their own time, kind of built this, and it got associated with Huawei somewhat unintentionally. GR Security pushes that this guy is an employee of Huawei, one of their highest, I believe.
I was going to say, not just an employee, they say a level 20 principal security staffer, which is like the highest level apparently at the company. So.
Yeah, so I don't know what their source is for that. I don't have access to that. That said, I do feel like the commit being backdated is definitely very suspicious. I mean, had they just added that commit after, GR Security calls out, it's like, oh, I better make it clear that, hey, I'm not actually, with Huawei or whatever, and Huawei, I just chose to use that for some reason. It would have been a little bit different, but the fact that they backdated that commit, definitely, something's going on with that. I'm kind of a little bit more willing to toss some belief into the idea that Huawei was maybe planning on using this. Obviously, they weren't using it yet. There's definitely the possibility that's not that. That genuinely is just somebody that, he also just worked on this on their own time, whether or not he's a principal security or developer or whatever.
I have a question here too. It's like I'm looking at the repo right now, and all I see is the .patch file. Was it always like that?
Yeah, it was just the README and the patch file.
And it was like that even before, like, all the GR security. Okay, I just wanted to make sure, because that seemed kind of weird that the repo seemed more empty than I remember it being. But
no, it was just that. At least on Monday, I can't go back further than, well, when I say Monday, I mean last Monday.
Yeah,
I can recall that was just the 2 files then.
Okay, so I mean, yeah, the commit date is pretty suspicious, and it's kind of worrying that their top security staffer is putting out code like this. It is pretty questionable.
Well, so on that, like, I'd be willing to believe that their focus was on these patches and what these patches could do and protect from, whereas the particular vulnerability that gets called out, if I recall correctly, it's was it not in like one of the handlers? Like just basically the caller, basically. Let me see if I can find it from GR Security again. Okay, state right, so
yeah, it was just in the right callback for the IOP or for the device. So
yeah, sorry, I was thinking. I was trying to come up with a charitable way to explain it away as just being like, okay, well, this was just kind of some throwaway code. The focus was on all these checks and, screw adding in all the security elsewhere. Let's focus on these checks, which are kind of the primary functionality of this, is kind of what I was thinking, but
yeah, it is just really blatantly like just not security, not at all.
There's definitely just no thought towards that here.
Yeah, but I will say,
go ahead.
I will say, even though this that commit date does look suspicious, and while we didn't know it at the time, there is a security staffer. Like, this guy is not just a random person out there that's not affiliated with Huawei. He does work at Huawei. I do think it still seems reasonable not to attach it to Huawei, just because looking at the past repos on the account, you can tell it's an individual account. It's not, it's not a corporate account or anything like that. I think that's one of it. I want to say it's the only one, but there might be like 1 or 2 others. But there's a lot of repos that aren't affiliated with anything Huawei attached to that account as well. So it does seem I don't think it's reasonable to attribute that to Huawei. Like, Huawei never tied their name to that code. So even though there is like a bit of a suspicious story around it, and people the common thing I've seen is this is a backdoor, right? That Huawei's trying to put in phones.
Drugi just mentioned that in chat. Actually, the whole situation is weird. Some people claiming it's a backdoor attempt, but it's not even remotely subtle. Maybe there is a miscommunication between employees and Huawei, or maybe Huawei is backpedaling because of the shit code.
It seems a lot more likely than a backdoor, in my opinion.
Yeah, so when it comes to the backdoor, I get why people are always cautious. Chinese companies, therefore, China can just make them do whatever. The thing is with that, generally speaking, the backdoor from China is all the data is passing through Chinese servers, therefore it can be logged, collected, and then China is allowed to store it, and then the Chinese government is basically able to access it when they want to. And I believe that's basically mandated by law that they will have to give access to that data that they collect. So the backdoor is just the fact that they have all the data passing through already. And that's where a lot of the concern from China comes from. That said, I mean, obviously, there is valid concern Huawei building out anything that's going to be used by, obviously they have phones, could be used by government officials. Those could be backdoors. There's reasons to that backdooring also. But a lot of the Chinese backdoors are really just the fact that the government's there. When it comes to something like this, I'm willing to say Huawei doesn't want their name on this, obviously. I don't think it's a backdoor. Even though could it be used like that? Sure. It's definitely very obvious. Like I said, I do kind of want to have that more charitable understanding here and just say that, okay, this is kind of like, it's in the right, it's not the important part of the application. They just kind of wrote their right handler here and
it's
just
like
kind
a
of left it
logistic
as
system. Like, it's not their main area. I see what you're going with that.
yeah,
But,
like the focus, what you want to break are all those checks that they're actually doing on everything. You can implement this securely quite easily.
Yeah. Like what I'll say on the backdoor angle is kind of like what Jergy is saying in chat is, if you're gonna do a backdoor, you don't want it to be super obvious like that. If you can plant a bug, plant a subtle one, because you don't want other people to find and potentially expose the bug, so you are forced to fix it, or you just don't want other people abusing that bug. You know, if you have the ability to plant a bug, you don't want to plant something that obvious. That's just really stupid. So that's why I think it's not. I don't think there's enough evidence really to suggest that it could be a backdoor. I think that's kind of a bit tinfoil hat for me.
Yeah, I mean, people definitely
definitely
like
an issue
hating on
and it's
China,
stupid.
though, for the backdoor idea. Like, anytime there's a security vulnerability, there's always the rumors about, oh, it's a backdoor or whatever. And yeah, I do
And
agree
China
with
has
you in
earned
this
that
case.
reputation, to be fair, with all the like stuff that they do. Like, it's not like it's unknown to them to do stuff like that. But here I just don't think it's fair to say that without anything more substantial, basically.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. Either way, I think we just wanted to bring this up as a bit of an update because there have been some changes from what I said. Mostly, I didn't realize that commit had the suspicious date on it. So I wanted to kind of call that out.
So we'll move on to Ziridium. So Ziridium, for those of you that don't know, it's basically they're an exploit broker, right? So they buy exploits for various things like Windows, iOS, Android, pretty much anything that's a high value target. They purchase exploits for. And they put out a tweet on May 13th saying they will not be acquiring any new Apple iOS LPEs, WebKit exploits, or sandbox escapes for the next 2 to 3 months because there's such a high volume of submissions for those vectors. And they said even after they start accepting submissions again, prices for one-click chains, like WebKit chains, for example, without persistence will probably drop. So these chains, if I remember, I can't remember if it was 2 million or one. I think zero-click iOS chain to kernel root with persistence was $2 million before. I'm guessing that's probably going to
I'm
drop.
not sure what it is right now, because I know, like, we've been seeing not really the iOS dropping. Okay, yeah, so it was 2 million, but we have seen Android kind of come up there. With Android, they're offering up to 2.5 million.
Yeah.
And that was back in, I think, September, when the price of an Android zero-click was worth more than an iOS zero-click.
Yeah,
so we've been seeing that change. So this one, I mean, obviously the fact that they're not accepting new submissions, like the big thing about Ziridium is the fact that they've been a very public broker that's just kind of always buying issues. Just like you find an issue, you can kind of go to them and sell. You don't
I think
need
they do need it weaponized, though. I don't think they just accept POCs.
Do need. What I mean is they're always accepting issues, though. It's not like they're matching you up with a buyer immediately.
Oh, yeah.
That's what I mean. Like, they're this very public broker that's consistently they're open to just buying the issues. They just have their list here of things they're interested in, and you can contact them about other things, but you can basically just go to them and sell at any point. They're not waiting for particular buyers for anything. It's just sell it to us and then we'll sell it on our own time or whatever. Which is different from some other brokers who will try and match you with, or will try and have a buyer kind of immediately.
So the other interesting thing about Ziridium too, like the other thing is they're basically the only public facing exploit broker that deals in, like, I guess the gray market you'd want to call it. Because a lot of them, you know, they're private. They're not, you know, you're not going to find a website for you to submit stuff to them. They mostly deal with, like, you know, behind closed doors kind of stuff. So Ziridium offers a really useful insight for people into that area of like how much things are worth. Like these charts on Zeridium and the statements they put out offer an insight that you probably otherwise wouldn't really get into the gray market with exploit stuff. So that's why I just kind of wanted to highlight that we're bringing this up, is Zeridium does offer that unique insight that you can't really get from other sources. Like, yeah, you have ZDI, but that's different, right? They're not selling to gray market. They're purchasing so that they can alert their clients in advance, and their payouts are going to be like 10 times less than that of Zeridium.
Yeah,
the same exploit.
Jumping back a little bit, the reason why I want to bring up how Zeridium does act a little bit differently in terms of just kind of openly buying things consistently is because that makes it quite impressive that they're not buying for something.
Yeah.
Like, I think they actually mentioned that maybe not, but I don't think they've ever really just, like, they have stopped accepting submissions on some things, but not in this sort of temporary way as far as I'm aware. So it definitely seems like I'm wondering I'm wondering what's led to the increase in submissions. Because obviously you can take that as one of two things. Demand has dropped for them, and they have like more stockpile than they even need. Or, well, I guess it's kind of two sides of the same coin, but or just there's been a lot more submissions such that there isn't enough demand for it. I'm curious kind of which way it went, if it was too many submissions or if it was just nobody's asking for them anymore.
I have a feeling it's probably the former, just because, like, just from like exploits we've covered on day zero and stuff this year, I don't know if it's just like a recency bias or something like that, but it seems like we have covered a lot more Apple issues this year than I remember even seeing last year, and we're not even like halfway through the year yet. So it does seem like there's a lot more Apple issues being discovered. I'm not sure if that's just because it's being looked at more. You know, people are starting to realize how valuable of a target it is, and more people are looking at it, or if it's just because there's newer code making it into the code base that isn't being vetted properly. Like if there was like a staffing change or something, I don't know. But I think either way you look at it, I think there has been a lot more activity in the iOS exploitation field this year than any year previous. It just keeps growing.
Yeah, I've certainly seen, like, I agree with you on hearing more in the past year about iOS exploits. That said, yeah, I don't know. Like, I don't know if that's necessarily related to just because there's also just kind of an increase. More and more people are continually publishing interesting exploits now, rather than just kind of selling them off or reporting them or whatever. Like, just in general, there's an increase on seeing those write-ups and stuff too. So it could be a bias related to that and not actually more people or more findings. The timing, I mean, could be quarantine related, you know, stuck at home, might as well hack your iPhone.
I think even if you take that into account, right, even if you take into account that there's maybe just more write-ups, the fact is just those write-ups being published makes it easier to break into the area of iOS exploitation because there's more resources out there, which means there's going to be more people coming in, and more activity in general is just going to mean more findings, more supply. And then because there's more supply, you know, the demand is going to go down.
Yeah, but there's more write-ups in other areas too. It's not just iOS, but iOS seems to be uniquely hit here.
iOS is also the most valuable target, basically. Like, phones are so valuable to hit.
Well, but they're paying more for Android, and they have been since September.
I mean, yeah, they're paying more for Android, but I don't know. Android seems to be kind of neglected a little bit compared to iOS.
Yeah, well, I think that's why they're paying more for it. I think that's a big reason why they start paying more, is to encourage more on the Android side.
Yeah, and it's weird because Android is easier to hit than iOS. Make no mistake, because iOS has like they have stronger sandboxing, as far as I know, than Android, and they have mitigations that Android doesn't have yet. Android doesn't have pointer authentication, for example, where iOS has had that for 1 or 2 years now, and that's not exactly trivial to get around when you're talking about like iOS kernel exploits and stuff like that. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting that iOS seems to have more activity, even though it's harder. Then again, maybe that's the attraction. You know, a lot of people who do bug bounties or just, who do vulnerability research and exploit development don't do it just for the money. They do it because of the, clout that's attached to it, and the challenge that's involved with it. And I think the fact is that iOS just has the highest challenge of pretty much anything out there, and that's why it's so popular of a target among really smart people. What will be interesting to see out of this, though, is if that money will be a motivating factor to see if people who have in the past exclusively done iOS research start to spread out to other targets. If it'd be interesting to see if we see some of those iOS guys start to move to Android or to browsers or something, like see if they move or where they move to. I think that'll be very interesting to see if that happens over the next few months.
Well, no, I think part of it, like, they do just mention that they're only they're not accepting those for the next 2 to 3 months due to the high number of submissions. So I mean, if you're doing that exclusively, that could also just be, okay, I'm taking a vacation for a few months.
Could be, yeah. But it could be a sign that
it could be a number of things. I mean, like, it's speculation.
I think the reason they're giving 2 to 3 months is because they don't exactly know how the exploit market's going to look in 2 to 3 months. So, they'll probably give another update at that time if they're going to extend that or if they're going to drop it or whatever. But yeah, I think we may see a few people move from iOS to other things. So
yeah, it's definitely a possibility. I mean, I think you'll see more move if this goes beyond the 2 to 3 months.
Yeah. What I will say would probably be, I'm gonna have a little bit of fun here and speculate where people could move to. Like, iOS researchers, if they wanted to move to something else.
Well, Windows Phone is the obvious.
Windows Phone. Well, that's actually kind of funny you bring up Windows, though, because what I was going to bring up was, I think the next area where people might start moving is VM stuff, virtualization, and Hyper-V, for example, is where I could see people moving to. Just because virtualization isn't really hit too hard yet. It's a very complicated field, so that kind of matches that, challenge aspect that a lot of security researchers like. It's a hard target to hit. It needs a lot of RE and research and stuff like that because, source code isn't out for a lot of hypervisors out there. So I think hypervisor exploitations might start to see a rise. We might start to see more stuff related to that in the future. So that could be fun to see. I also wanted to bring something up from that Jurgi put in chat. Apple's iOS 13 has been particularly buggy, enough that SVP software engineering reported overhauled the company's internal software testing process to avoid a repeat when iOS 14 rolls around. Yeah, and I mean, I think I've actually seen that from some of the iOS researchers I follow on Twitter as well, is iOS 13 has just had like a myriad of issues. So it's probably, it might be a combination of both, with iOS, with them not wanting to pay for them, with the supply going up, it's probably more issues being found because code made it into iOS 13 that is bad and wasn't vetted properly, combined with the fact that there's probably more people looking at it. And like you said, Z, especially with the COVID situation, even more so. So I think it's a combination of things, I think, that led to this. And I think eventually it will even out. I think it will go down and, they will start buying them again. But I do think we see some researchers move, basically.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you that some people will move. I do think there's going to be a fair chunk that maybe try and stick it out if it is only for a few months. That said, Razzie Wu out of chat now also mentions that in September 2019, there's a quote from, I don't see a source on who's saying it, but basically mentioning that the 0-day market is so flooded by iOS exploit that we've recently started refusing some of them. Just mentions that that's a Wired, so I'm not sure who they are, because I don't think Wired was the one buying it. At least I would assume that Wired wasn't. I guess that could be some investigative journalism tool, but that said, that was in September, so we could see a move out of iOS. Or perhaps it is just iOS 13. Once we see a new iOS, maybe that'll bring more people in or not. I do agree, like, it's definitely going to shake things up a little bit.
So Z, you wanted to bring up Hacksazat? I don't know how to say
Hackasat.
that.
Hackasatellite. CTF coming up. It's this weekend, actually. So I just wanted to kind of call it out as it is a little bit interesting. A little bit different than most CTFs. So it's space, you can see on the page there, Space Security Challenge 2020. And as you can guess by the name, Hackasat, it's about satellite hacking or space technology in general. So this weekend is a Jeopardy-style CTF. Anybody can play, but the team lead and contacts do need to speak English. And I believe it's at least your team lead needs to be a US citizen or permanent resident. So that is one of the limitations of it. You can play, but I don't think you can qualify for the final or the prizes. Otherwise, there's some other restrictions related to like government employees participating and how they can participate. They can't use government facilities, various things like that.
Can they use Ghidra?
Yes.
Technically Ghidra comes out of the government.
So they mentioned it has to be something that's freely available. So if it's a government facility that's available to anybody to use, that's different than them doing it as, say, part of their job. They do actually make an explicit mention about how you can't be participating in an official capacity as part of your job or related to your job, things like that. Nonetheless, did want to call it out because that is this weekend. It's something different. It's cybersecurity still, so it will be like your Jeopardy style CTF. But they do mention they've got an emphasis on space systems, so the FAQ mentions a few of the categories, which includes stuff like communication with satellites, knowing the tools and the protocols, hacking satellite applications over the message bus there, communications via like the modem, RF communications, payload modules, flight software, orbital mechanics. They also mentioned calling out some of the science, the astronomy and astrophysics, orbital mechanics, and various space algorithms for star tracking and navigation. So things like that. Seems like it'll be a kind of an interesting CTF. I don't know how... I have no idea how hard the challenges will be, but it seems like one of those CTFs that you can play just if you've got an interest in kind of the space tech, that'll kind of force you to learn some of it and give you a little bit of experience. And then the top 10 teams get an invite to the final event, which uses FlatSat with a fully automatic satellite. Basically, that's kind of for the communication aspect, and then it's kind of like a virtually, what type word is that? A virtual/simulated space environment. As far as I know, you don't actually get to hack a satellite. That said, they do call the last stage of this their on-orbit challenge, which they limit you to only 2 submissions. Which, I mean, the way they say that sounds like you may actually get to send a payload against an actual satellite. Probably not. I'm assuming it's all virtual, but they do call it on orbit, which definitely makes it sound a little bit more interesting.
It's a very interesting theme, and it will be interesting to see, like you were talking about, like all the algorithms that go into like the astrophysics and stuff of it. It will be interesting to see how much of a challenge that presents, because when you're talking about a timed CTF, you generally don't want challenges that require like a stupid amount of backing research before you can get into actually hacking it. So it will be interesting to see how they strike that balance between realism and also making it accessible within like a timed CTF.
Well, I think they're kind of okay with making it a little bit less accessible because it is a very focused thing. This is coming out of the US Air Force with a particular focus on, I think this was the final event was, I believe, supposed to be at Defcon. Like the Aerospace Village or whatever.
It's now at Virtual Defcon.
Yeah, so it'll be on Discord. It's a little Discord room where all the hacking happens. To be clear, I don't know that. That's just me saying things. But I can imagine that they're willing to go a little bit more on the inaccessible side. They're making it clear that you should know about these things. You can prep for it. They're probably trying to find teams that could do this type of work. I mean, I don't think this is recruitment or anything, or at least they explicitly mention that this isn't like recruitment, that there won't be any job offers or anything out of it. But I could understand if they were making this with a focus on it being a little bit less accessible because it's in the specialized area.
So another thing I wanted to point out too is not only does this CTF sound interesting in terms of the theme, it has the backing of the USAF, but it's also, this is a qualifier, right? Like the final is at the virtual Defcon, like we were saying earlier. So qualifiers usually don't have very large prizes, but this qualifier actually has $10,000-$15,000 prizes for, I would say, the top 10 teams, but I'm guessing the top 10 qualified teams. Because, if you have a team lead that isn't a U.S. resident, you probably don't get that. So the top 10 qualifying teams, they have $15,000 payouts for. So that's pretty crazy. 150K total, prize pool for a qualifying CTF is... I don't know if I've seen it before.
Sorry, I'm not seeing that prize listed. So what I had listed here as prizes was 50,000 for first place, 30 for second, 20 for third, but that's part of the final. I'm not sure where you're seeing.
If you, I'll scroll to it. It says online qualification, start May 22nd and May 24th, and it says 10, 15K prizes. The final has 50K, 30K, 20K you were mentioning. It's not on the FAQ page, it's on the homepage. That might be why you're not finding it. If you just go to the homepage and search for...
Okay, seen.
Yeah. So that's like really high.
So 15,000 for each of the top 10.
Top 10 qualified, I'm guessing, yeah.
Yeah, so in the FAQ, they do mention that to accept a prize, you do have to satisfy all the eligibility requirements, which does include the U.S. citizen being your team lead.
Yeah. So, it's coming up, and it'll be interesting, and it's definitely got, a huge incentive behind it, so, wanted to bring it up for anybody that would be interested in doing a CTF that has a high prize and has a cool theme to it.
Yeah, definitely some interesting tech behind it. I'm half interested, but I've got some other stuff going on this weekend, so I don't think I'm going to get to play too much. So I used to be part of, back when I was in university, my school's space design team, and we built a little CubeSat, so I have a little bit of experience with that, so I'm definitely interested to see what type of challenges there are. Now, to be fair, my experience, I would just help implement some of our comm stuff. I didn't, do the engineering of the satellite itself, but it definitely interests me, though.
Yeah. And, keeping on the topics of CTFs, obviously, Defcon Quals were this weekend.
Before we switch, Razzie Wu asks, do you think it's possible to register an LLC in Delaware to be eligible for the prizes? And no. You have to be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. I guess the US, they do call companies people and stuff, but I don't think your company can be a citizen or considered a permanent resident. That said, they do have the rules file, and it's just the one member of your team has to be a US citizen. The entire team doesn't have to be. So it is open to other people, just you do need a US citizen involved on your team. Sorry, as we were going to change, though, Defcon qualifiers just happened. I think we were going to talk about that for a couple minutes here.
Yeah, so I was busy during the weekend doing the toolchain stuff, so I didn't really I didn't try any of the challenges or anything. That being said, I do know quite a few people who did try the challenges. Apparently the challenges this year were pretty crazy in terms of difficulty. I don't know if you could speak to that, Z, because I think you tried a few challenges, right?
Yeah, so I played a couple of the challenges this weekend. I didn't want to spend a ton of time, although actually it was Droogie out of chat ended up dragging me into working on one. But so I played just two of the web challenges, Upload and Poot. Or Upload It, I think it was called, actually. I'll say the challenges, with some of the past challenges, I felt like there's been some guesswork. Some mind reading needed for it, and that was kind of my feeling. I think when we talked about Defcon Quals last year,
yeah,
I kind of mentioned
a super high opinion of the Quals last year, if I remember right.
Yeah, so this year I still have some issues, especially with one of the challenges that I worked on that I kind of felt like they just lacked a lot of direction on the challenge. So I can't say that was for everything, but in particular Poot, and I'll give people a warning, I am going to spoil it here as I talk about it. So if you don't want any spoilers, skip ahead or mute for a moment. But with Poot, it was a simple kind of web proxy that you had. Source was provided. You could find in the comments of the HTML access to the source, just like a Python Flask application. So fairly standard for a web app challenge to provide you source. It was a proxy. You give it a URL like domain path, and it'll make a request using Python requests, and it'll replace all of the links, or rewrite all the links. Basically just what you'd expect from a little web page proxy. Had a admin that would, if you sent feedback saying like, hey, this page doesn't work, an admin would visit that page. They would visit that page through the proxy, and then you could break out of the proxy and actually make some requests using the admin's browser. That's kind of hinted at in the description. In the description, it talks about our secure Poot proxy allows you to continue browsing securely and hide your IP address from your visited websites. So breaking out of that, it's kind of clear that that's kind of what you're about. Somebody's using the proxy, you're trying to break out or break through it. That said, once you broke through it, there's no real guidance left to know kind of where to go from there. The solution, like I know both myself and a number of other teams looked at the Redis and used the Redis queue. So kind of tried to communicate with that system. And tried to communicate with other internal systems, some enumeration. And I know as I was doing the enumeration, I did that myself too. Definitely felt like it didn't feel like the right route to go. Like, I mean, a lot of these that's more hack the box or something that will have you brute force. Nonetheless, they didn't give any real direction on what to do from there. So that issue, I think, kind of remains from the past. Like there is some mind reading that was necessary. In this case, I do think there are some very minor changes that could have been made to this challenge that would have made it clear, or that would have provided a little bit of a hint saying what to do. But the actual solution ended up being installing a service worker so you can intercept all the requests that the admin makes to the proxy, and you'll find that they make a request to a page with the flag. That said, figuring out that you should be installing a service worker, once you're executing JavaScript on the admin's browser, which is just a headless Chrome, you can do so many things from there. Without any guidance, because there's so many possibilities, even though that challenge wasn't that hard, I think it only had 18 to 20 solves. I'm not sure what it was at the end, but the last time I looked, it was only 18 solves. Had they had any guidance that hinted towards the admin browser accessing something else, that could have gone up, and it could have felt a little bit more fair because there was something. I'd kind of mentioned, I thought, if they just added, with that statement, continue your browsing securely and hide your IP address. If they just added, and hide your browser history from your ISP or something, just a little statement like that, it's enough of a hint that if you think about it after you're on the admin to know to go after the history, it could work, but it's not enough that it would spoil it. Things like that. And I felt that about some of their other challenges in past years too. There's the browser user agent one, or just some slight tweaks to give guidance on an appropriate approach for each stage would have been useful. And I guess I'd really echo that same thing back here. Is it really comes down to just making sure as you design a challenge, how are people going to come up with the appropriate process? And I get it. There's a balance that needs to be maintained. They're a difficult challenge. You don't want to give everything away. But you also don't want to leave it as so wide open like this one was. It's there's so many possibilities. There's no real indication that, a service worker is the right thing. You just have to kind of think of it and know it.
Yeah.
And I will say the other one I worked on was Uploadit, which Flask app, really small thing. Actually, I saw the right path to that really quickly. and then was just too lazy to actually do it.
Fair enough. So one thing you see, especially in Defcon CTF for whatever reason, is you love to see when challenges get solved in a way that's different from the intended solution. And in the reverse engineering server, somebody actually linked a write-up to one of those challenges. It was Not Be Fooled, and it was supposed to be a additive transfer attack on elliptic curve cryptography, which I'm not familiar with. But they actually solved it in a far easier way than the challenge was intended to be solved. They provided the task script, which was written in Sage, but Sage was on Python 2 for a while, so it was a good guess that it was running Python 2 for this challenge as well. And the input function in Python 2 evaluates the input it receives. So you could literally just write in echo or sys.stdio.write open flag.read and just print out the flag. So that's always fun to see, is when there's unintended solutions to challenges, and as from something as trivial as just using Python 2 instead of Python 3. So
yeah, well, I mean, that's definitely, they mention it being, Python 2's most dangerous foot guns, that input function. I mean, that is quite legitimately one of Python 2's foot guns.
Yeah, so I thought that was pretty funny. Overall, though, it seems the opinion of the CTF this year was a lot higher than previous years.
Yeah, I would definitely say
people saying challenges were fun and not
I still see the same thing that I was mentioning before, but I enjoyed working on the challenges. It didn't feel as bad as some of the past years where it was just yeah, I got stuck because of feeling like the mind reading on the one challenge there, but at the same time, I still feel like it was a reasonably fair challenge. I think it would have been better with more guidance, but I didn't feel like there's just nothing at all to go on.
It wasn't as guessy as some of the challenges last year.
That's it. Out of chat asking, it doesn't make sense why still it works. Yeah, input in Python, just calling input evaluates what you provided. There's another function in Python 2 called raw input, which will just read input, which is what I want to say you should be using, but I don't want to make that claim because that very well might be another fuck gun. But I know input itself is commonly used, and yeah, it evaluates everything you kind of put in there. There was another one that was kind of solved. I don't have the write-up prepared here, but it was BIOS. Of course, all their challenges have 3 O's in it. But the idea was you had to read the flag from a floppy disk, but you didn't have an operating system, you didn't have a BIOS, so you had to do all of that yourself and do the VGA output yourself. I'm not, so Blake asked, BIOS list was easy, wasn't it? I'm not sure what its rating was. I didn't even try the challenge. I only did those 2 web ones. I was kind of sick through the weekend, so I wasn't playing too hard. Wasn't playing competitively at all. I just, like I said, I looked at that upload one, saw the solution kind of quickly, but didn't actually bother with it. And then Drugi got me interested in Poot, so I worked on that for a bit. I wasn't playing competitively. I didn't look at most challenges. But the solution, they ended up... had I known we'd be talking about the unintended solution, I have tried to have this one ready, but basically they ended up just abusing the fact that it was running on QEMU and use some functionality of that to get output rather than actually implementing their own VGA write or anything from the floppy. They just abuse QEMU for it.
Yeah, I found it funny. Some people were saying this was QEMU CTF because there were a lot of challenges that were virtualized in QEMU. Because I think there was a kernel exploit one too that I actually kind of want to look at because the details of it that I saw from people who were trying to solve it looked really interesting. But one of the things I wanted to shout out before we move on is the source code for all of the challenges for the CTF went out basically instantly. So
definitely not instantly.
Not instantly, but very close to the time that the CTF ended. Like, I think it went up like 17 hours ago for all the sources.
I don't think source. Well, I guess technically you have source for Poot. But they uploaded over a few hours. At least for the public one. But yeah, I don't see like Poot in here yet.
Yeah, I think there are, like, here and there are some challenges missing, but generally with, like, CTF, sometimes you either never get the source or the source drops, like, pretty late. And I think it's cool, especially for, like, a CTF as reputable and as, you know, high praised as Defcon CTF. I think it's really cool to be able to, you know, check out those challenge source codes for people who are, you know, into CTFs and stuff to kind of see some of the behind the curtain stuff, I guess. So, you know, that might be interesting to some people out there, too. I will also say I loved the Zoom theme that they had for the CTF. That was
yeah.
that was
I
quite
can
a nice
never
touch.
fault them for their UI.
Yeah, it's always pretty good. That being said, though, I don't think I think that's pretty much everything around Defcon CTF, unless you have some last minute thoughts on like other challenges or anything.
No, like I said, I only really worked on the two. I was really happy to see the desync one. So that was upload. It was a desync attack. Just because that is kind of a newer thing that we've talked about that on the podcast a few times. Yeah. But it is a newer attack. Like that was just like dropped basically last DEFCON Black Hat, whichever it was. So like it's a fairly recent attack. So, you know, seeing that
you probably see in CTFs often.
Yeah, so seeing that was nice. I haven't seen it in another CTF. There probably is some that has already done it, but it was nice to see.
Yeah. So getting into exploits. Up first, we have one in vBulletin. So I will be honest, vBulletin is a forum software, and forums are kind of dead nowadays. So I don't know how many people are actually using vBulletin anymore. But the issue that this exploit talks about seems to be in the infraction subsystem. So if you've ever used forums before Reddit basically killed them all, especially in vBulletin, moderators can give infractions to people, right? Which increases like a point counter on the user's account. It sends them a warning message, and when a threshold of points is reached, the user automatically gets banned or some kind of punitive action happens, right? So they have an endpoint in their API for getting infraction-related information, which I'm assuming the endpoint they abused, which is get indexable content, didn't have permission checks in it, probably so a user could see their own infractions, even if they weren't like a staff member on the forum or something like that.
Yeah, so I'm not clear if this is authenticated or not.
I don't think it's authenticated.
It doesn't. I don't believe it actually makes mention of it either way. So it may or may not require authentication. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't think it requires authentication just because when I looked at the script of the exploit code, it was just checking if the API endpoint exists and then exploits it. It doesn't check for any kind of authentication or anything. So
yeah, fair point, actually. Yeah, so probably doesn't require it.
Yeah. So, you know, obviously when you're talking about infractions with all this information, there's a lot of database stuff going on behind the scenes for getting information on each of the infractions by its node ID. And that node ID in the API endpoint wasn't protected against SQL injection. So it was a very straightforward SQLI. It was just a single quote union. And the other thing is with vBulletin, it's not blind because anyone with vBulletin can see the database structure to easily exploit this. You know, it's not like you don't know anything about the table structure or anything like that. So it was fairly easy to abuse. What I found interesting though was the way they actually abused the SQLI to, you know, make it useful. So basically what they did was they used the SQLI multiple times to like pull off a multi-stage attack to basically reset the admin password. So they used it to get admin details like the email and the username, and then they used it again. They created a CAPTCHA instance, and then they get the CAPTCHA answer from the database using the SQLI. They then force a password reset, and they retrieve the token from the database and use that token to set a password that they control. And then from there, they can just backdoor it. So yeah, the issue is fairly trivial. I did like how the flaw could keep being abused to get all the information needed for the stages. I'm assuming they needed to do that because they probably couldn't directly modify the table data. They could probably only extract it, which makes sense because the database account used for that API is probably quite restricted. They probably can't just change the admin password.
It's less about it not being restricted. More what the issue is with PHP, you can't just inject a semicolon and then do like a update. Even though you've got
Generally
SQL Injection, well,
Depends
I don't.
on
There probably
query
is some
or the
system, but most
database
systems
structure.
can't. Like PDO, the default system for basically doing all the queries in PHP, doesn't support multiple queries. There are some systems that will like explode on the semicolon and kind of create them. Generally speaking, you can't. So if you've got an injection in a select query, you just can't update or modify entries. You can only retrieve them. And generally speaking, we see a lot in select queries because they're just kind of like the easiest to detect and the easiest to take advantage of.
Yeah. So what I think was cool about this is obviously this attack works for this bug, but this seems like the kind of attack that can be reused for any other issues you find in vBulletin that are based like in an SQL injection. You can probably use this, like reuse this attack method of, leaking the admin credentials and then forcing a password reset. It seems like a method that's not really going to be broken very easily without like redesigning the system, which probably isn't really going to happen. Like I said, I don't even know.
Yeah, and I don't think that's new
anymore.
to this exploit either.
No, but it was new to me, and I think this exploit it has some like interesting and source code for anybody that might want to look at vBulletin. But yeah, I found the attack strategy kind of interesting. Like you were saying, it's probably not new. It's probably been used in past vBulletin exploits, but I just thought it was interesting and it was new to me. I don't know if it was new to you, Z. Like, have you seen this kind of attack before? Maybe not in vBulletin, but just in general. Have you seen?
Yeah,
like,
in general, like targeting the admin passwords is pretty standard. Right. I mean, I think we've talked about that dark black hat hacker one a few episodes back. I want to say he kind of had a few chains there that started off with. Yeah, I don't remember if he did an admin reset or not, actually.
What makes this issue more impactful, though, is this is not like a lot of form exploits and stuff that you see are based on like plugins. Like, it's kind of like WordPress, and that plugins are pretty vulnerable, but generally the core is pretty good. This issue exists in all VB installations, as far as I can tell. They all have this API endpoint. It's not just a plugin vulnerability, it's a core issue. So, if for some reason you're running a vBulletin form in 2020, you might want to update or like do a workaround, remove that endpoint or whatever. Because it's a core issue. It's not just a plugin issue. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say on that. It sounded like you were going to say something, Z, before I kind of cut you off there. So I'll just...
No, actually, we've covered it. There's not a lot that's terribly, like, I guess you could talk about as you did, you talked about kind of the post-exploitation, but the actual issue is pretty straightforward.
Yeah. So, getting into a headlining topic, taking over HackerOne. We have a subdomain takeover of resources.hackerone.com. So we cover bounties on HackerOne a lot, but we don't cover bounties for HackerOne a lot.
Yeah, I think we have covered at least one or two others, though.
We have, yeah. I can't remember what they were, but we have. This one, it's not like a super technical issue or anything. It just seems like
it's pretty much the same sort of issue we saw actually when we talked about hacking Roblox, or however you say that. I'm not familiar with the game, but with that one, so actually with this one, it's basically they had the resources.hackerone.com had a CNAME going to this read.uberflip.com, which is like a marketing type of applications. I'm not familiar with it, definitely haven't used it before. They had the domain there, CNAMEd that subdomain to it, and then obviously they've just kind of stopped using it. So it was no longer connected to any account in Uberflip, which means that anybody who registered an Uberflip account could then claim resource.hackerone.com as being their domain. Because the only real validation is, can you point the domain to our, can you set that CNAME record? So just because that record was kind of hanging out there, anybody could do that. Anybody could basically control most of the content on that page and serve things from it. It's not as impactful as last time we talked about this sort of issue with Roblox, just because with the Roblox one, you could kind of reach chat. It was whitelisted into the API. This one, sounds like the domain basically was never used. I'm not sure if any cookies will be scoped to be sent to the subdomain that could be exfilled that way. That's it. There's some back and forth, some discussion, because they initially gave him $50 for it. He came back, basically got his bounty up to $500, but
back
was
and forth,
requesting.
I think, is an understatement. There was crazy amount of drama, I guess, in the comments of this report. The report author wasn't happy with the low severity, and I think even now, now that the report is kind of, disclosed and it's resolved, he's still not really happy with it. I don't think he was expecting a way higher impact than he actually got.
My big question, I don't think he raised it there, was, and perhaps that's just because he could validate it himself. I don't have a HackerOne account to check. But is like if it would send cookies up onto the subdomain, like if there are any cookies that are just scoped, kind of just be sent on all HackerOne, that could actually be more useful, and that wasn't brought up here at all.
Yeah, the triager actually put in there the reason for the lower impact or severity, and I have the quote here. It says, primarily the privileges and confidential data were the primary factors. Privileges were high as you needed to sign up and buy a version of their product, and HackerOne has less confidential data compared to the subdomain, the resources.hackerone.com has less confidential data compared to our platform data. So they don't explicitly say cookies, but I'm guessing what they mean there is that important cookies aren't scoped to that
so
subdomain.
They don't explicitly say it, so because of that, there's also just that chance that it was overlooked.
Yeah.
But there's also the chance that it's just not scoped out like that.
Yeah, there was a ton of back and forth. There was even a debate on them getting different scores on a CVSS calculator. There's some funny content in there if you want to just go looking for some funny posts to read. But yeah, it seems the researcher never really was satisfied. Do you think that like 3.6 low severity is justified in this case? Obviously, we don't have all the information. We don't have like what cookies are scoped there, but
let me check what the CVSS is. Is that listed up on top somewhere?
I remember I just saw 4.3.
I mean, I see the vector string. I just don't see it from.
I think it's in a screenshot from Jobert. Yeah. And the screenshot's not showing for me, of course.
Yeah, it doesn't show for me.
It's
either.
Expired. Awesome. Okay, so I guess
it is here, kind of.
But yeah, there was definitely some like conflicting, a bit of debate in the report section. But yeah, the author of the report was basically saying this would be the lowest subdomain takeover severity I've ever seen, and that's why I was kind of curious if you kind of would agree with that statement.
The big thing with subdomain takeovers is, well, one of them is obviously you could do phishing type attacks from there. I actually don't think you could do that in this case, because you are limited to the sorts of pages and files that you could display with this marketing tool. That said, you might be able to. I'm not familiar enough with it. But a lot of bounties don't really pay out because you can do phishing. So it's a subdomain takeover. It's not, assuming cookies aren't sent up to it, so cookies are all just scoped to their HackerOne domain and that's it, which is reasonably likely, or at least the sensitive cookies. So you can't expose any confidential information. If the domain's not whitelisted anywhere to make any sort of AJAX requests over, then you're not able to access any APIs, sensitive APIs, do anything like that to automatically get stuff, which was the case with the Roblox one. It could access that chat API. So somebody visits that and then you can exfil all the chat stuff. So it just seems like, and they mentioned there, like, HackerOne's threat model has changed in the last few years since the last subdomain takeover. So I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't be rating like subdomain takeover generally as high. I mean, it kind of comes down to how you're able to abuse it. And it is one of those cases where I don't feel like CVSS really captures the necessary information.
It's not the bad metric, no.
Just because when it comes to subdomain takeover, it's so sensitive to the application in terms of what you can do with it.
It's too contextual. Like,
yeah,
it's too much context that isn't captured by CVSS. I see what you're kind of saying there. Yeah. So I guess in this context, I'd kind of agree that the researcher probably was expecting an impact that was too high. Like you're saying, like all those points you pointed out make it pretty difficult to exploit, and that is kind of what they were saying actually in the post. He was saying like I didn't POC it because I didn't know if I was allowed to, I think was basically what he was saying. But yeah, like you were saying, it would be hard to really do anything too useful with that. So I think it's fair as well.
I mean, on the other hand, though, you can POC this without actually taking it over. And that's just redirected locally. Use your host file, set up a redirect so you control and see what you can do with the domain. I guess, like, whether or not you want to call that a POC or not, I guess, can be up in the air, but I'd call that a POC. You can at least explore and see what you're able to access from the domain view. Just control everything that's being served.
Yeah. So we'll move on to MyLittleAdmin. So this is a SSD disclosure, which is quite a common sight among our episodes. So MyLittleAdmin is a web-based tool for MS SQL Server. The vulnerability is a pretty straightforward issue. It uses a hard-coded machine key, which is used for serializing objects, which is then used to execute commands. But Z, I know you wanted to talk about the use of hard-coded versus default here.
Yeah, well, I think we should talk about the issue first, before we get into talking about whether or not it's actually a hard-coded password. So the core issue is, it's another one of those .NET deserialization attacks. If you're kind of familiar with .NET, and one of the common things with web apps using like .NET MVC or whatever, or ASP MVC, whatever it is this view state value. The view state value is kind of like your session, except the session is stored completely on the client, just the serialized object that gets encrypted and then just stored on the page. That way, as an application developer, you don't have to have a database storing all your user information. It's just kind of stored on the page. I mean, you still need to track some user information, of course, but there's a lot of stuff that you can just track kind of in this view state value. Because it's stored on the client, though, there's always a chance that the client can mess with it. That's why it is encrypted. By default, now it is also authenticated. That wasn't always the case. So you have some older systems, there's some fun you can do with that. But effectively, all that's happening here is MyLittleAdmin uses the same key across all their systems. This validation key, decryption key there. They use the same key across their system. So you can encrypt your own view state. As I mentioned, this gets deserialized, therefore standard deserialization attack. So that's the issue. My issue on whether or not to call it hard-coded is this is stored in the web.config file. Pretty much like where it always is stored. It's web.config. So I would call something hard-coded when it's actually in source. When you have like a source file that goes like if password equals and then a string to the password. That would be a hard-coded password, for example. Or if it has the crypto key and it's literally hard-coded in there, like key equals and like this byte string or whatever. When it's sitting inside of a config, I would just call it either a static or a default. Like it comes with a default key.
Yeah, so I will say it is. I do see the terms hard-coded and default used interchangeably.
Yeah, and to be fair, this is nitpicking for me. That's not really that big of an issue.
I was going to say, I've probably even used hard-coded when I've met default before, too. I think you might have called me out on it before on the show. So, I mean, it's a very easy mistake to make, but I think that is kind of an important distinction because changing the key in a configuration file is leagues easier than monkey patching a binary file that has it, hard coded into the, source code of the program. So, I mean, I think that
this one can be changed.
Important distinction. Yeah. That being said, I think it is fair to expect it to make it more obvious to change or easier to change than having to manually go into the configuration file. But I guess that's kind of a different conversation.
Yeah, so that's kind of so this isn't like a value that's set by well, they probably provide the default web config. But this key and stuff, the view state is all implemented by the .NET. It's provided by the framework. It's not something that MyLittleAdmin has created. So kind of hardening that, I can understand kind of expecting a little bit, but no, it's definitely an issue. Kind of MyLittleAdmin is providing this config, not including the instruction. I don't know if they are including any instruction to change that, but that is something they could fix. They could even generate a unique key or have a routine that would generate the config. There's a lot of ways they could approach that instead of having just this default key in there.
Yeah, so fairly straightforward issue, but I know you did want to go on that little nitpick about hard-coded versus default, so wanted to bring it up. Issue isn't super duper interesting or anything though. Up next though, this issue is a little bit more interesting. This one is a DOM-based XSS in Gmail due to Google Voice extension. So this is another one of those bugs that was found by accident. They just weren't expecting to be able to find it. It just kind of popped up.
Yeah, and so it's a bit of, I could say, universal XSS, because it's not just in Gmail. They found it on Gmail, and they initially reported it thinking it was on Gmail because they got this alert one on Gmail, and they had the subject there from Google Ads about basically the XSS being in the subject. It appeared.
Yeah, I think they said it worked on Facebook too.
Yeah, they call out Facebook, so you kind of see it as universal. I mean, realistically, it's in the extension. It's in this Google Voice extension, not actually in accounts.google, not in Facebook. So they say add accounts.google.com, and I mean, it is a way to get it to execute on Google, on accounts.google.com, so that is fair in a sense. But the source of this is this Google Voice extension.
I will say, by the way, I'm just looking at that screenshot, and I didn't even realize before how many extensions is this guy running in that screenshot. When there's more extensions than there is a URL bar.
Yeah, there's at least two.
At least two. I think. Well, you're not wrong. Yeah. But yeah, it seemed to be caused by a funny quirk, caused by the fact that in this case, Google Ads customers' IDs were in the same format as 10-digit phone numbers. That's kind of what prompted them to find this issue. And because of that, Google Voice extension thinks it's a phone number and makes it a clickable link, even though it's a Google Ad customer ID. And the JavaScript function that does that has a bug that ends up executing the full content of the DOM object containing the phone number instead of just the phone number itself. Because on phones, if you click a link and the link is plus and then phone number, it will do some IPC with the phone app to try to phone that number. So generally you just want to execute that plus phone number, but for some reason the code snippet here, they ended up executing the wrong variable. So the code posted here, I disagree with the author because he says it's easy to read. I don't agree with that, because these are all single letter variables, and for people not really familiar with what's going on here, this is not fun to read.
So I want to jump back. You talk about it executing the variable, and So first of all, I will say I do agree with you on. So this is clearly minimized. This is minimized code, and then it's just been prettified. So uglify and then prettify it, and then this is kind of what you get. Not easy to follow, and I'm actually a little bit unclear on where exactly the vulnerability gets introduced. That said, I mean, you talk about being on the phone, but all these screenshots are if it's working on desktop. It's not, so when it's talking about execute, I don't believe it's talking about doing any of the IPC to actually go to the phone. It's talking about just the evaluation of it. So it ends up creating
Yeah, sorry, the evaluation for doing something like that. I should have been more clear, though.
Well,
I kind of misspoke.
It gets evaluated when it gets injected into the DOM. So instead of including just the safe string that just contains the phone number, he kind of mentions... I'll see if I can scroll down to it. He mentions that they believe the developer was going to execute variable f that was holding the value of the phone number. Gives an example of it. Instead, for some reason I can't understand, he executes a variable a. I don't know where in this code this execute is happening. He gives the two code examples of a.parent node inner HTML equals y and doing a k.parent node.insert before. So I don't know what he's talking about when he says execute it. The only thing I could take that to mean is as he's running, or as it's being injected in there, like he's talking about the variable to be injected. That said, like the code more or less makes sense to me with what it's doing. Because what it's doing here, when we're talking about A and H and all of that, H ends up being this span tag that gets the phone number in and a link to call with Google Voice. So that's kind of where it creates that. I believe it creates a field somewhere else also in there, but and then it goes through, and if there are any child elements on this, it'll just replace the inner HTML of the parent. Or if there are no child elements, it'll replace the inner HTML of the parent node with this tag that it created. And if there are any child elements, then it'll insert before, so it'll just insert it as the first element, this tag that it's created. So what ends up happening is, or where the issue I believe comes from, is it runs this, not quite a regex, but where is it? As it's kind of scanning the code, it's using XST or whatever, the XML query stuff. It's querying for all of the text nodes, runs through all the text nodes and just runs the regex on, saying like, okay, here's a text node. Does this text contain a phone number? If this text contains a phone number, takes that text, swaps out the phone number with the link, and that's where it includes this f variable, and then the rest of the code is just figuring out where to include that f.
I think the execute you were talking about was the VCA. That's where I took it, where I believe the execute is happening, but I'm not 100% certain on that.
That's possible. I'm not sure what VC actually is, though. They don't include that function.
Yeah, they should have included that function, because I think that's kind of an important missing piece of the puzzle.
Especially if that is like an eval, but my assumption here, what I thought was going on, was because it does a text content, it's going to decode those encoded characters. It's going to get the, like if you have a and greater than or and GT in there, it's going to treat that as being a less than, or yeah, it's going to take a less than character. It'll take a greater than character if you have like GT in there. So it'll do the decoding. So where I thought this issue was coming from was the fact that it does that text decode and then uses that when it creates the tag. So I thought it was just ended up decoding it, and then it injects that into the span that it creates to actually inject. So then that gets injected into the page. Perhaps I'm mistaken about that, but that's my understanding of what's going on. I think it would have been nicer if they included the entire code, so we can know what this VC does, for example.
Yeah, there's some missing information. And the other thing is, too, the fix section doesn't really say how Google fixed the issue. It's just like a theory of why the issue exists, and like how you could just execute the other variable and avoid the issue, but they don't say how Google actually officially fixed it. And that's one of the things I go to try to understand the issue is, okay, how does it fix it? Why does this fix work? And then you kind of reverse engineer from there. So without that like proper fix information, it is a little bit harder to understand the issue. But you know, it's one of those bugs where I am a bit surprised that this wasn't really discovered before. I guess it is in the Google Voice extensions, which probably not a lot of people use. But it does seem like an issue that should have been fleshed out, like, by now. But I don't know. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. But it's one of those bugs where it kind of has you scratching your head as to how it escaped testing, really. Because it seems kind of obvious in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that was just recently introduced too. Like, refactoring code or something. That said, I will mention, like, this write-up just isn't all that clear. Like, I don't think this is a good write-up. It's not something that I'm going to sit here and say, like, yeah, you should give this a read. Like, no. I don't actually. Like, I had such an issue trying to follow what was going on here. Like I said what my theory is about what's happened. Because all this mentions here is, and here's the sing. This is quoting it. And here is where the sync happens. And that's where he includes that a.parent_node.inner.html assignment. And the next sync is the insert before. So he makes it seem like that's where the issue comes in, not that VC. But if that VC is doing something worthwhile or important, like, should have mentioned that. Otherwise, and if it is what I mentioned about the text node decoding it and then being able to re-inject it, but re-injecting it after it's been decoded, if it's that issue, then that should have been mentioned. There's a lot of missing information here. But it is kind of just more of a point towards the ability to compromise kind of any page effectively because of this Google account, or because of this Google Voice extension.
Yeah.
The importance of your extensions can open you up to vulnerabilities.
Yeah, this is a really good example of that. So I believe this was submitted through the Google VRP, which we've covered before, just because if you look at the reward section, he was paid out $3,133.07, which is the...
sounds like the Google price or payout.
Yeah, so I think this was done through VRP, so it's we like to cover the VRP stuff when they come up, as they, we've been seeing more of them recently. I don't know if that's just because they're being published and they're older issues, but yeah. We've been seeing more of them, and we'll probably see more of them. So we'll get into some more technical issues here. This one is from Almond Consulting, which is playing with GZIP, RCE, and GLPI. So this blog post talks about hitting a French IT-focused issue tracking system called GLPI, which stands for something different in French. In English, it translates to Open Source IT Equipment Manager. There's actually a few issues at play here. So users with maintenance privileges in this software can perform SQL and XML dumps, and there's no CSRF checking on that functionality. And they also allow a get parameter to specify a different file to back up to from the default one. So you can kind of see where this is going. They can specify where they want to write an SQL dump to. So you can just dump the SQL to a publicly accessible folder from WebRoot because it doesn't really protect against path traversal. So you can use that to exfil database data, but it's not really an RCE at that point, but already there's an issue there.
Yeah, although it is worth mentioning that one of the important issues that they had to solve is, how do you know where the web root is? So while it does allow path traversal, that doesn't, if it's not already in the web root, then you need to find out where that web root is in order to get it somewhere you can access, because it just backs up to a file that may or may not be web accessible. And that is one of the things that they kind of had to solve in tackling this.
As far as I knew, they didn't really struggle with that. They just said it was in var www GLPI. I don't think it was...
I don't know if they even try to, but they do. I believe they just mention that by default that they're stored in this file / like var www files / _dumps.
Yeah,
but they do mention, what if GLPI dump dir has been changed outside the web root or is protected by a HT access. That is something they kind of call out as a potential issue here.
Yeah. So, what's made interesting too, though, obviously, the ability to be able to dump the database to a potentially public directory is an issue in itself. But what made it even more interesting towards that RCE aspect was the file they're dumping isn't just an SQL file, it's an SQL GZIP file.
So before we get into that, actually, are you going to talk about the hashed path stuff?
No, so you can get into that.
Yeah, so that's how they dealt with the path, knowing where to actually dump it. If it was moved somewhere else. The hashed path disclosure I thought was kind of interesting problem. Not something I've seen before. So what ends up happening is the application, when it creates your session cookie, you're able, this is all in PHP, so you have the session underscore name, and you can actually tell PHP what to use as a session cookie and what to read as a session cookie. Rather than just using like a static name, it uses GLPI underscore, and then we'll append the MD5, and then the real path of GLPI underscore root. So it basically appends the MD5 of the root path to the application as the session cookie's name. So by brute forcing that session cookie, you can discover what that root path is. And that's how they're able to get around not necessarily knowing where those dumps are being stored, because they can give an absolute path that just goes, if they see the cookies, this 40D1, like if they see that hash in there, they can brute force that hash to get the path. And I say brute force, use like a custom dictionary of common paths. Odds are it's going to be fairly predictable. But that was the hash path.
Generally not like
path disclosure.
Crazy customizing that.
Yeah, no, I imagine most cases are going to be in the var www area. But if something does, the fact that it's exposed in this way is just kind of odd.
Especially for like an IT software. It's another one of those things that you would think would be kind of wise to that kind of stuff. But
well, no, like this technique. So the idea here is that by default, PHP is going to use like PHP SES-ID. It's just going to use that static name. So if you end up running this on a domain with other applications kind of just mounted on it, then they're all going to end up sharing that same session ID, and they might not be sharing the same PHP session store. So it can just cause issues when you kind of have different applications clobbering that value. So you want to create a unique cookie for your application. Doing it as GLPI underscore PHP SES-ID probably would have been sufficient, rather than like MD5ing the path as how they do it. Because I'm going to assume that it's not too common to mount the same application multiple times on the same domain. Could happen.
It's something I've really seen. So
well, I'm just not familiar with this. Like there are applications where you might do that, but with this one, I'm not sure if it is. That said, even if it is, odds are, if you're running this in Docker or something, they're all going to have like var ww, and they're going to be clobbered anyhow if they're running default. So there are other ways that they could have gone about doing this. Using the path just seems completely weird to do.
It's kind of a code smell in a way. Like it kind of indicates that there's probably deeper issues, which of course there are because we're talking about it. So yeah, with that, I'll jump back to the SQL stuff. So the SQL file, the database file, is not just an SQL file, it's a GZIP SQL file. So if you can partially control the contents of the database, you can craft a polyglot GZIP and PHP file to embed like a shell into it. So they go through some of the process that they had for doing that. So, to be able to pull off an attack like that, you want to have the structure of the database that you're constructing the polyglot with. So that's where they kind of get into this hidden get parameter, which is yet another kind of oddity that on its own isn't too powerful, but when chained allows them to do the RCE. And that's that they have this GLPI events table that they dump here. Let me just scroll down to it because I don't have it written down on my notes for some reason. Okay, there we go. Yeah. So they have this get parameter offset table, and they can actually dump the table with that variable. So you can see they have a dump of the table GLPI Wi-Fi networks, and they just have the table structure of that Wi-Fi network. And there's a little section in there, comment, which you can set if you're a maintenance user. So, for the rest of the issues that they hit for this RCE, they do assume that you have some level of access. They assume that you have access to the panel through like a maintenance user or something like that. They theorize later on that it might be possible without that, but for now they assume that you have that level of access. So one of the things that a maintenance person can do is they can add a new Wi-Fi network, and they can add a comment on that. And that allows you a decent degree of control over the data that's going into that database file that gets GZIPed. So they go through how they construct that payload. So one thing I
will kind of mention here really quickly is that hidden get parameter. Basically what it's doing is it'll dump like all the tables. Using that, or all of the content. By using that, you basically provide the offset into it for it to dump. So it won't dump everything. So that way your control of the data, that data that you actually control, can be very early on in that dump, if not like the first thing that actually comes out of the dump, which is important when they come into attacking the GZIP. That way they're not having too much noise from blobs earlier on.
So they go through some of the hurdles they had with constructing that payload. Apparently GZIP has some like anti-XSS filters in it, which I didn't know about. That they had
GZIP doesn't. The application does.
Oh, okay. I misread that. I thought that was in GZIP specifically.
No,
okay,
so it's just that they do the SQL or XSS filter. Yeah, GLPI's anti-XSS filter encodes the characters before saving them in the database.
Okay. I read that as in being in GZIP, so that was my bad. Okay, so GZIP, they encode the characters properly. So that's obviously an issue when you're trying to inject PHP code, right? You need the lesser than question mark, or you need an opening PHP tag. There's a few different ones they go with. They don't actually go with the question mark PHP one. So they found kind of an interesting solution around that. Instead of trying to embed the PHP tag themselves, they actually use the uncompressed block header, which can have a value that decodes to a lesser than character depending on the length. So they can get a tag in a compressed block, but the code they had to execute would be in the uncompressed block. And this is kind of tricky because there's data that you don't control between the opening tag and the shell content. And this is what you were kind of talking about with the noise. You can't have like invalid PHP code in between the tag and where you inject your shell, or it's just going to fail. So that's where they kind of get into some of the interesting things you can do with PHP tags. I actually didn't know about this tag. You can just use, it's actually not, I guess, an official tag, but they use the lesser than question mark equals tag. So I haven't seen that tag before, but apparently that's for like echoing and stuff like that.
It's an official tag. It's the short.
Yeah, I misspoke.
Well, it's part of the short thing there. So in particular, equals is specifically, it'll echo whatever you put out next. So that way you don't have to do like, if you're using PHP more of like the templating style, so you have like an HTML file or .php, and just in there you have like angle bracket question mark. Rather than doing echo value, you can do equals value. It's just kind of a shorthand for doing an echo. That said, as you're going to get into, they kind of abuse this, so you can give it a double quote string. So PHP does treat strings differently depending on how you quote it. So a double quoted string will interpret variables that are inside of it, whereas a single quote will just do the literal string. So even if you put like $ some var, it'll actually print the $. What they end up doing, and sorry to kind of steal your thunder a little bit, Spectres, you're going to get into that, is they end up doing a quote, or a comment, start comment. The start of a multi-line comment, that is, so like /*. So that way they can inject that in the compressed output. And then unquote it, as long as, they don't accidentally get a / anywhere before their actual injection. They can just unquote, and then in their actual injection, have access to the PHP. I thought that was an interesting way to go about it, and I didn't know you could quote like that in the equals, or after like the question mark equal sign. I mean, I've never really tried. Usually if you're using like question mark equals, you're doing that because it's short. So you're usually not putting quotes there. So yeah, I just didn't know you could do that there.
But yeah, it is kind of an interesting trick that they use the comment, and then they basically comment out that second compressed blocks data so it won't get interpreted. But like I was saying there, like I didn't even know about that tag, the question mark equals tag. Obviously, I'm guessing the way you're talking about it, Z, you've known about it. I don't know if you've used it, but that's kind of new to me. I feel kind of bad because it's been a while since I've written PHP code, and I don't write it regularly, but yeah, I was kind of surprised I didn't know about that tag.
Yeah,
but
no,
yeah.
It's been around forever.
Yeah,
like it's definitely not like a new thing. I could understand not being aware of it because short tags isn't enabled by default, but you'll generally come across it if you just have done a lot of work in PHP.
Yeah. So they abuse that tag like you were saying. Now there was a bit of like it wasn't super straightforward because generating that sequence of characters isn't really something you can easily control, right? It's based on the compressed block length and stuff like that. So they had to kind of brute force that to get it to work. So they ran a script and ran it like overnight or something. I can't remember if they said exactly how long it took to brute force it, but there was a bit of brute forcing involved. But they were able to find a block that would cause that opening tag to be there, and then they could inject their web shell into it. They would close the comment, put their shell in, and they could get RCE on the application. So there was a lot of like hurdles they had to overcome. It wasn't like the issue itself wasn't like too hard, like complex or anything, but actually exploiting it was, which
yeah,
I guess
the GZIP aspect actually does make this pretty interesting exploit, I think. I mean, yeah, it was just brute force, but I don't know if anybody else who's taken that approach. Obviously, because you can have they talk about it, like it being done like the PNG files, but I don't know. I'm not familiar with anybody else kind of taking this type of approach for it, getting it in the compressed block versus using like just an uncompressed block or a literal that ends up in there because it couldn't get compressed.
It's definitely like new to me. I haven't seen anything that
I
goes that
like
way.
it is just brute force, but it's a clever way to go about it once they kind of have GZIP, how they can take advantage of, or have control of what's being GZIP'd, how they can take advantage of that.
Yeah,
I could see that being a CTF challenge since we've talked about CTFs earlier.
yeah, this seems like that type of issue. I feel like it actually kind of reminds me of a challenge you designed at some point, but I'll get to that later. But yeah, like I said earlier, this specific attack does require technician access. They do say in their final notes that theoretically this can be hit by an attacker without it, like a valid account, because you can use failed logins because of the logs that they save to the events table to insert data into the database to trigger the bug. But they say that it's probably not, like, practically speaking, doing that is going to be a lot more difficult because you have less control over the data. You also don't have as, like, you're hitting it blind, so it's theoretically possible, but it might not be practically possible. They didn't really explore it, so it might be possible to hit from an unexploited context. But this write-up just goes completely from the aspect of a technician, pulling off like a malicious, like an insider attack, basically.
Yeah, no, I think it's fair, though, that they made that assumption, because they did show, like, hey, here's this area where you could pull off the same sort of attack, but you have a couple additional hurdles that aren't impossible, or that likely aren't impossible to get around, and then just deciding, but for the sake of doing a write-up, we're not going to deal with that. Like, I think that's completely fair assumption to make on their side.
Yeah, I agree. So the remediation was a Sony style fix. Their fix provided in GLPI 9.4.6 was they just removed the backup feature. They didn't fix the actual issue. They just removed it
if the code's not there, you can't exploit it.
Yep. I mean, it's definitely a valid fix method. It's just it always feels lazy, and I always laugh when I see it. Like, they just don't want to fix the actual issue. They're just like, people probably don't really use that functionality, so we're just going to get rid of it. So,
Which actually, like, I feel like a backup though probably would be a functionality that's
I know.
used.
I was like,
There might be another
functionality
thing
was there
though
for a
it.
reason, I would hope. Yeah, maybe it was just like legacy, stuff that was in there for like development stuff and was just never removed. But anyway, yeah, I always find those fixes kind of funny. So, like I was saying earlier, I'm pretty sure you designed a challenge that kind of reminded me of this. See, it wasn't, it wasn't the same, but I feel like you had one where you could execute code or something like that, but you had to make a hash check or something succeed. And in that way, kind of like in this case, you had to do like a specialized brute force. It wasn't like a full brute force.
That was the CRC32 shell code.
I think it
thing.
was the CRC32 shell, where you had to forge
like
the
it was a
CRC
pwn.
hash.
It wasn't a web, right?
Yeah, so it's obviously it's not like entirely like this issue at all, but it kind of reminded me of that. It's kind of got a little bit of a parallel there with requiring that little bit of brute force and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, so
kind of
that challenge, I made that challenge just so you kind of get right. So that was you can either brute force the CRC32. I just wanted to do CRC32 forging. That was what that challenge was made for. But yeah, you forge a CRC32, and then that would be used. I don't remember if that was used as the pointer or if that was used as the value that got written. I feel like that would have been the pointer or the index or something.
I think it was a pointer, if I remember right. But it was a little while ago, so.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure if I still have that challenge on. It's definitely not on 0x.
Yeah. That's why I didn't feel too bad about spoiling it, because I don't think it's up anywhere anymore. It was on the old 0x, so.
Yeah.
So getting into an article by Checkpoint, who is another, site that we see quite often on this podcast because they do a lot of good write-ups. Here they talk about an interesting discovery they made when they were testing bugs they discovered last year on the Microsoft RDP client for macOS. And the issue comes down to how paths are interpreted by Windows, especially when it comes to, forward slashes versus backslashes. And it's specifically in the Windows API functions, the path CCH canonicalize function. I hope I said that right. Canonicalize. It's kind of a weird tongue twister word. But anyway, basically what this function does is it tries to take a path string and evaluates it, and it converts it into a canonical form. And this is used to check the final path against path traversal. That's how they used it in these RDP clients.
And that, just to be clear, that's something I've even mentioned before, is when you want to look to make sure something isn't doing any sort of path traversal, don't bother looking in the string for like your ... and trying to remove that or trying to fix it up. Just get the canonical path and compare that prefix on it. If the prefix is where you want, and obviously make sure it's not going into yet another folder if you don't want it to, but usually just the prefix is fine, but that's app specific. But this is definitely something I would tell people to kind of do. So your canonical path is going to be it's an absolute path, but every file will only have one canonical path. So with just being absolute, how symlinks and stuff get used can vary. Like there are some places where you could have multiple paths of the same thing. So Belika mentioned, isn't that what everybody do? So many times I run into people not doing that. We've talked about directory traversals before, even where they do some checks. No, people just don't seem to get that idea. Just resolve the path, check the prefix. Super easy to do. That said, the interesting thing about this issue is that's not sufficient.
They tried to do it right and they failed.
Well, it's not. I don't think whoever wrote the code here, just the code using this,
the Windows
this
API failed them.
Yeah, this is how you should be doing it, and it doesn't work. You can break it.
Yeah. So what's weird is, Windows has always been kind of contrarian to Unix in that paths like to use the backslashes instead of forward slashes. I never understood why, because it seems really dumb, because backslashes have always been used to escape characters, so you always have to do a double backslash. But anyway, even though Windows prefers those, they have supported forward slashes for ever. Just because, people like using forward slash paths just because of the familiarity with Unix and stuff like that.
Well, and you don't have to do double backslash. You only need to write one character.
Yeah. So The problem is this Windows API function only considers backslash. It doesn't consider forward slashes, it just ignores them. So if you do like a backslash to try to escape the current directory or go up a directory, that was considered by the canonicalized function, and it would, adjust that in the path. But // was completely ignored. So when they went to compare the strings, they were equal, even though the one string had the path traversal through the // So the patch wasn't sufficient. So Microsoft just didn't consider that case in the function. So obviously the documentation for that Win API function doesn't say anything about that behavior. So looking at this code from a layman's point of view, if you don't understand that like quirk with that function, you would think, okay, this looks fine. And I think Checkpoint even said, originally this function was broken and they fixed it with this code, which they then exploited further. But when they looked at the patch, they said, okay, looks like this issue is fixed. And that was from their blog posts last year. And when they looked at it more closely, they found it wasn't fixed because of that weird quirk. So Checkpoint decided to have a little fun when they found this issue. They presented their software devs with a challenge to implement a function in Windows that receives a file path and is resilient against path traversal. And they found, I think they said almost all the implementations that they got use this function, the path CCH canonicalize, and they didn't consider the slashes, so they could all be broken in the same way. So that's part of the reason they put this post out there, is even though this post talks about it in the context of the RDP clients, they figure this issue probably exists in a lot of different applications because of that issue existing in the Windows API. And the way it's being called is the way that Microsoft, expects you to call it. I think it's still the recommended function to use to prevent path traversal. So what's kind of weird is when they reported this issue to Microsoft, they didn't actually patch the Windows API function that canonicalizes it. They just made it so that they replace all the forward slashes in the RDP client with backslashes before calling the API function. So they fixed the issue in the client, but they didn't fix the issue in the Windows API. I don't know why. I don't know if there was like some weird logistics behind that was hard to push through.
They can break the API now, but somebody somewhere has an application that depends on that difference. I don't know what it would be, but this is. Obviously, this itself, it's fixed in the RDP client, so whatever. But as an issue, there's absolutely going to be other code that checks for path traversal in this way, and it's, the recommended best practice is not the best practice.
It seems like Microsoft kind of dropped the ball there. I think even if you were right and for some reason they couldn't fix the actual API function implementation, they should have at least amended the documentation and made it clear that quirk exists. That way, when calling this function, ensure to replace backslashes with forward slashes with backslashes. Because it's not hard to do that, but if you don't know that you don't have to do that, then people aren't going to do that. So if you couldn't fix the function, you should have at least amended the documentation. So, Microsoft should get called out for this a little bit, because
I agree.
Like you were saying, this is going to cause issues in other applications that it's not really their fault. So, yeah. Fun fact, though, I didn't look into it too much, but something in this blog post said that they actually used this issue to escape a Hyper-V guest through the Hyper-V manager, because I think the Hyper-V manager has access to the host paths, and you could pull off that path traversal from the guest. So usually path traversal is definitely an issue, but it's not something you typically consider as like a VM escape vector. So I thought that was kind of interesting, but that's kind of a side note. The more important note is, that Windows API function doesn't function as expected, and hopefully Microsoft, at least amends the documentation to make that more known. So yeah, I guess this post isn't just a research post, but it's also kind of a PSA, I guess, in that regard. So we kind of wanted to make sure we covered that. That being said, we can move on. So we haven't had a named exploit in a very long time, Z. Well, we've been going dry a little bit for a while.
Well, Faxhell, which is related to this one, Wasn't that long ago. We just didn't talk about it.
Oh, okay. So we haven't talked about named issues in a while. I guess that would be more accurate to say.
And we didn't really talk about that largely because so it was released as like a part 2, and now this is the part 1, talking about the actual issue. So
interesting release order. We got the prequel. This is the prequel.
Release order and very long and detailed read, to put it nicely.
Yeah, so basically the issue here, they talk about a permission bypass in the print spooler service, or daemon, which is where PrintDemon comes from. And this post was done by Yarden Shafir and Alex Ionescu. I think Yarden is his like mentee, I think is how he describes them. They're kind of like a teacher and student relationship kind of thing. But this post gives a lot of background into how printers and stuff work and the details of how the print spooler works under the hood with the registry and all that stuff. I will say I think the post is a bit too long because it doesn't seem like you need to be too intimately familiar with all of that background to understand what the issue actually is. And they don't get into the issue until the very bottom sliver of the page.
Yeah, no, you don't need to be that familiar. It's very kind of easy to attack. That said, and he does actually mention this early on, is, but this is Windows internals. Well, I don't think he says .com, but Windows internals blog. So we're going to go into the internals.
Fair
so
enough.
I could give it to him for that, but yeah, there's actually, I think I linked you to a Twitter post that basically summarizes it. And I'll just bring it up here. But the understanding of the Twitter is create a printer port pointing to a missing DLL in a privileged location, print to that port, crash the spooler service or reboot. And now your original print is written to the DLL path as system and ready for DLL hijacking. It all fits in a tweet. That's the gist of what's going on for this attack. The specifics of it. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I'm gonna go a little bit deeper into it. Basically, the issue seems to be like if you just go into a printer dialog and try to add a printer port that goes to a DLL in System 32, for example, you do get an access denied prompt, which makes you think initially, okay, this is safe. You can't just create a printer port that points to a DLL in a privileged path. But what they actually ended up finding when they dug into it was if you add it directly through something like PowerShell, the port isn't validated. The problem is the port validation happens on the UI side of the printer dialog. It doesn't happen in the actual component that adds the port. So
to be clear, some of it, so it doesn't happen when it adds support, but it will happen when you try and print, when you try and write to it. See, check happens when you try and access the printer port. So even though you might be able to overwrite a DLL with this in a privileged location and add the printer port, until you can try and write to it. And just to be clear, so when we're talking about the printer port, when you have a printer, you've got the printer port and obviously a printer driver. Drivers can generally be added by anybody as long as it's kind of like a driver that already exists. You can't like add a new driver, but you can load printer drivers that already exist in the system. So your generic / text only printer driver will effectively, when you're printing to it, if you literally just print a byte to it, it prints that byte out. So when we're talking about like printing, you can literally just print bytes out to a file. Your printer port could be a file, which I actually didn't know. I had never really looked into it that much. Like it doesn't surprise me that much that it could be, especially like this generic one. If the port was a network, it would just write those bytes out over on the network. So you have those two parts. So having the printer port, you could set it to whatever file you want to kind of write or print to. But when you try and print to it, that's where the access check comes in. And obviously in the UI, as you mentioned, it'll check it then when you try and add. But if you use the commands, because that check only happens on the access, you're able to kind of get around it by creating it, and then later you're able to escalate. But I'll let you keep talking about it.
Yeah, so like you were saying, if you try to access the file or access the printer port, you will get an error because they attach a user token to the file access operations. So if you try to exploit it, it will fail because your user is not really good. It's not going to have permissions to write into like system32, for example. But where it gets interesting is if you can crash or kill the spooler or reboot the system or anything like that, the file access will succeed. I'm assuming this is due to it using a system token before the user token can be captured. So the default token that it uses before it gets rewritten has more privileges. I'm assuming that's what's going on there.
I believe what goes on here, he kind of talks about the shadow job file that's created by the spooler to kind of track the actual job itself. What ends up happening is that it doesn't contain as much information as the job actually has. So it just doesn't contain the impersonation token. So it'll just use system if it ends up rebooting and needs to read that shadow job file. I believe that's what it was. I might be mistaken.
Okay.
Like I said, it's a bit of a long read, and he talks about a few different things that are semi-related.
Yeah. Ultimately, that file does end up getting written without that impersonation token. And what you end up with is not only is the file being written and you're bypassing the access control check, it's also persistent because it's on the file system. But the other thing is because the write isn't being impersonated as the user, it's also stealthy. Because if you go into a like system32, for example, and you see a DLL file there that's written by a user, that's going to be pretty suspicious. You know what I mean? If you're doing forensics or something like that, that's going to be kind of a red flag. But because that impersonation token isn't being used, it's writing it as system. So it looks like a legitimate DLL file that's in there. So it's kind of like a two-pronged issue. It's not only allowing you to do the access control bypass, but it's also taking away that trust factor, I guess, a bit, because it's not being impersonated as the user who actually committed the print. So, like we were saying, there's a lot of background there. It's an interesting issue. I think they even said in the blog post this was like one of their top 5 Windows issues in the history of like looking at Windows stuff. Which
I mean,
this has been doing it for a while, so that's kind of a...
This is definitely one of those issues I kind of go and say, like, it's a fun issue, because it's so easy to take advantage of. And the issue itself is just, like, it's logical. It's not, like, anything crazy, memory corruption or something. It's a logical issue. You kind of just get it.
Kind of.
Yeah, like, this is something you could explain to somebody who isn't super technical. I mean, the DLL aspect, okay, like DLL hijacking, maybe not. But I feel like the core issue, like, you can kind of explain this one to somebody who isn't super familiar.
Yeah. So overall, it's a fun read. I will recommend, though, if you don't care about too much of the Windows internals, you can just skip down to the bottom of the page to where the actual issue is, or you can check out that Twitter post that Z linked as well. But yeah, it's always fun to look at printer stuff because printers have always been one of those things that haven't really kept up with time. The printer spooler service is probably one of the oldest services probably still running on Windows. So it's not too surprising that you find like issues like that in that area. But printers are like so weird in how they work, and that's why I think they're kind of fun to look at from like an exploitation point of view and stuff like that.
Oh no, I feel like fonts might be pretty old too.
Yeah, that's another good shout. Font parsing is hell. I've dabbled in font stuff a little bit, and it's not fun. I'm not gonna go into a discussion about that here because it's pretty off topic, but it's awful. I hated it. I hated life when I had to work with fonts. So, next we will get into security flaws in Adobe Acrobat Reader. So, Adobe Acrobat Reader, we're talking about Adobe. It's not surprising that there's multiple issues in here. This blog post details 3 vulnerabilities in the reader for macOS.
Yeah, 3 vulns that are chained to kind of get the one thing of being root on OS X.
Yeah, exactly. They can all be chained together to LPE to root. And what makes it more impactful than it otherwise could have been is it seems the updater component of Adobe Acrobat Reader is not sandboxed. And this is kind of an important detail because Apple's sandboxing in both macOS and iOS is pretty damn strong. Precisely for preventing attacks like this, Apple's really good with their defense in depth. So the fact that this this updater component exists outside of sandboxing is the reason why the article author went after that component. So getting into the actual issues, the first issue is their updater uses XPC for inter-process communication, which is an Apple-provided IPC mechanism. It functions over XML and property lists, which we've actually talked about a little bit in the past with Seguza's write-up. I think that was last week. And basically what they do there is they do a check on the bundle ID of the client process for authentication. Problem is that trust in the bundle ID is kind of misplaced. That bundle ID can easily be faked by just, creating the directory structure yourself. So the trust put in that bundle ID is unfounded. And that kind of breaks assumptions that lead to the other issues. So the second issue is the download folder from the client bundle directory is moved to a temporary folder, which is outside of the user access, which is owned by root. But if the download folder has a symlink, which is basically a symbolic link, that symbolic link is still kept, even after it's moved to that root protected directory.
Yeah, and I'll quickly mention that temporary directory move, basically what's going on there is the idea of that is so that it moves it somewhere that the user can't write to, so that the next issue basically wouldn't happen. That, as it does any sort of validation stuff, the user can't modify. So that's why it's moving this temporary download. Obviously, it's doing an update, so it's going to be downloading a file to update. And the first issue there, just kind of be clear, basically it ends up meaning that any application can connect and call the XPC functions or send the messages and pretend to be something that's not. You can go on into the race condition.
So the third issue is, it's very common. You see it on Windows a lot. It's not just on macOS for sure. And it's a race condition in the validation of the binary file in the temp test folder called hello root. And this binary, as you can probably guess by the name, is ran as root. And so this binary file is validated to make sure that it's not just a malicious binary that was played there by an attacker. But like Z was mentioning, because of that second issue, because you can control it through the symbolic link, you can basically cause a time of check, time of use issue. You can write the valid file there to make it pass validation, and then post validation, symlink it to the file that has the malicious content, and then you have you can run an arbitrary binary as root.
Also,
LPE.
Just one slight inaccuracy there is you've already got the symlink going out somewhere you control. So rather than symlinking it to the invalid binary, you're just replacing the contents of where it's symlinked to. Yeah, the symlink already exists. You're just changing the contents between when it's a valid binary and when it's going to get launched. Just because you just mentioned putting a new symlink, which isn't quite accurate. Because you can't change that symlink once it's moved into the temp directory. But because that symlink goes somewhere outside that you do have permission to change, you can still change the file itself.
Yeah. So essentially recapping, the first issue allows any process, like Z was saying, to use the XPC, and then that facilitates the ability to exploit the second and third issue, which is the race condition, to modify the contents of the binary that's run as root. So this was really cool. Most of the time when you see LPE write-ups, they're generally one stage. This one is 3 stages, and you have a mixed bag of issues between all of them. You have a false assumption, which causes the logic bug, and you have the symlinking issue and a race condition. So it's fun to see those kind of tied together. Getting into the fix is they just check if the folder contains any symlinks before validating the binary. They use a new function called validate paths, so that'll check the path of the file that they validate, and if it's a symlink, it'll reject it. It just won't process it.
Yeah, and on the exploitation note, I will just add that they do, because obviously with race conditions, you always want to enable as large of a race window as possible. So you want as long of a period as possible between that validate binary call and the launch arm hammer, which is what they call their updater. You want as long of a window as possible between that. So what they did for that was effectively just trying to flood that XPC service to make it busy while doing the race. to try and create that. And that's all they did. I just wanted to point out they did have something to try and create a longer window for themselves there. Because that is, like, as is, it's, literally if statement and then it's used, that isn't a huge window.
Yeah, those race window extension techniques, I think, is like the official, like, or the de facto term for it. But like extending those race windows in themselves are often really interesting. In fact, I've seen entire conference talks dedicated to just extending race condition windows, because of race conditions can be so unpredictable, and unpredictable is something you don't want in exploits generally. So yeah, that's definitely a good mention there. Is those are always fun to see because they're generally clever in how they work, and they're valuable information that can often be reused in other situations. So yeah, it's good that you brought that up as well. Thank you. So that concludes all of our exploits. We're going to move into our research portion. And our first one is on cloud web application firewalls. So this is a blog post by Tuomo Makkonen. I think I said that right. I hope I did. And this research is a little bit older. It's from March 6th and April 14th for the second part. But we figured it's still worth covering because it's almost certainly still relevant today. And it's basically looking at cloud web application firewalls to evaluate how different ones perform at preventing common web application attacks. So in the first blog post, they looked at Azure Application Gateway, Barracuda Web Application Firewall as a Service, AWS WAF with Amazon Managed Rules, and AWS with Fortinet Managed Rules. And the types of attacks they tried were command injection, XSS and file inclusion, SQL injection, path traversal, and malformed XML documents.
Yeah, and just as we get into this, I'm going to say I had never really looked at AWS WAF and the cost, but it's expensive. Like every rule you add is like $1.
$1 per
month.
Per month?
Which is, and then I mean that's per application too. Or like per group that you have it in front of. So like it's, I don't know, like that really encourages you to just use their managed rules which they provide, which can provide you, I'm going to assume they have more than just 20 rules. I think the Fortinet one though is like $20 a month plus some other costs like for actual traffic. Like obviously it's AWS, so everything else there. But I mean, I don't know, that really discourages having a lot of rules. Obviously, you don't want a lot of rules, but I don't know. That just feels like a very small amount of rules to have.
That does feel kind of anti-consumer because charging on a per rule basis doesn't really make any sense. It's not like it costs them more really per rule added.
Well, it kind of
bit
does
predatory in a way.
So the idea though is because all of these rules need to be run against every request that's coming into the WAF. So you don't want, like, you can't have a lot of rules. It's like having a bunch of routing rules or something. The more rules you have, the slower things get, the more CPUs needed, and the longer every request takes to get through.
Yeah, but $1 per rule, that's a lot. Like you were saying, that's
it feels like it just would add up way too quickly. Now that said, I didn't look at what Azure Application Gateway costed in terms of the rules, and using the managed rules, you did kind of just pay a flat rate. So that may include more than just more rules than what you'd expect, but then you'd hope that they have good rule sets. And the results were kind of surprising, kind of not.
Well, one thing I did want to ask before, or add in there before we get into the results, is even with the AWS managed, you're limited to how many rule groups you can use. So they mentioned that in there is they had to kind of pick and choose which rule groups they wanted to use in testing, because I think they could only use up to 6 rule groups. So they used the SQLI rule set, the Linux rule set, known bad inputs, common rules, PHP rules, and admin protection rule set. So even if you use the managed one, you still can't use like more than like a certain number. So you're paying
yeah, well, there's more rules inside of each of those rule sets, though.
It's a set, yeah.
So I'm not sure what the managed. Actually, I think. I'm not sure what Amazon's managed one cost was. I don't recall.
Yeah. So, like you were mentioning, the Amazon one does sound pretty expensive. And with the managed rule set, you were wondering, okay, you would hope those rules would be good. Well, when we get into the test results, it doesn't look too promising for AWS. So they ran tests against all the web application firewalls we just talked about, and they measured their success rates against different types of attacks. So the AWS WAF with Amazon rules did the poorest out of all of them, actually. With a few categories like command injection and SSIs, they were at under 5%. It was like really low success rate in preventing the attacks. And I think their highest was 45%, and that was with path traversal, which in theory is probably like one of the easiest categories to like mitigate against. The Fortinet one did a little bit better, but like not much better. And then the Azure the Azure WAF actually did the best. Its lowest number was 71%, and that was in cross-site scripting and command execution.
Azure did the best for part one. I've got part two results up here, and Google Cloud Armor actually I think did the best overall, even though SSI Azure caught 100, whereas Google Cloud caught 99. On everything else, it was either tied or equal. So I was kind of mentioning there that it was a little bit surprising, a little bit not surprising. And they kind of mention it, or they do mention at the end of part one, their conclusion is they were expecting to need to kind of come up with some custom bypasses to start seeing the differences between them, not for them to be just so terrible right off the bat. But what's not surprising here is you'll notice, for those of you actually who can see the video and not just watching, the Azure WAF has in brackets CRS beside it, as does the Google Cloud Platform Cloud Armor has CRS beside it. Cloudflare also has the CRS beside it, but it's using a different CRS. So CRS is kind of where I'd say it's unsurprising. CRS is the mod security rule set. So that or like the rule set. So that's coming. I believe OWASP was involved with creation of some of those, or a lot of it. It's the core rule set for mod security. So it's been around for, I want to say decades, but it might have been somewhere in like mid 2000s when it actually started. I don't know the actual start date. It's had a lot of time to mature. It's seen a lot of attacks, been able to slowly add and improve to it. It's been around for a while, and that maturity shows in these results. By using the latest version, you're getting, these 90% of the attacks being blocked. Now, on the other hand, like, this could be overzealous blocking. Because, I mean, you could get 100% if you just block everybody in every request. So, like, it is worth kind of pointing that out, but I'm going to hope they at least test that for false positives. I'm not sure if they did, though.
I don't think they did.
Which actually would be another interesting thing to look at here is false positives. So when I say false positives, I mean just normal requests that aren't actually trying to be an attack. Because most of these requests, like, just because it's blocking something for command injection doesn't mean there actually is command injection, like in the end application. The application firewall is just looking at the request and trying to prevent it there, not even letting it hit the app. But that said, I mean, it really is just, it looks good for CRS and mod security. The work they've done there, like that it's open source. You can run that yourself. And that maturity shows here, I think. I'm disappointed by the performance of some of these other services. And for Cloudflare, they're using an older version of CRS. I don't know which version, but that's why there's a significant difference between how Azure and Google Cloud Platform do and what Cloudflare got.
Yeah. So what I was going to say there was, I think that is a good point to bring up, just because when you're talking about like a web app, the user experience, you would probably have, you would want potentially less blocking than overly aggressive blocking. Like, you would rather, especially because, like you were saying, it's not even guaranteed there is an issue that it's going to be able to hit. So you don't want to like hurt the user experience. So that is a really good point to bring up. The most interesting data set I found out of all of the tests they ran were against Cloudflare. Now, I know you said they are using an older CRS, but what I found weird was actually the inconsistency between categories. Because when you look at like Azure and Google Cloud Platform, the numbers are all pretty close. Like you're looking at like 100, 97, 83, 99, 99, 91. But then when you get to Cloudflare, you've got like 99% in path traversal and then 2% in SSI. Like there's like way more of a gap.
They just removed SSI. They're just not checking it. I'd be quite confident to say that. So SSI, it's funny, I was actually talking about SSI on Reddit a couple days ago, where somebody had mentioned like they had no idea what this is. SSI is like .shtml files is where you normally see it, or shtml if you want, but it's, I've never seen it used, well, this decade or last decade.
I want to say we covered something on the show, actually, like maybe a couple months ago that used
I don't know about using
HTML
SSI
inclusion, but
no, the XXE is different. SSI is literally like, well, let me just pull up an example.
Yeah, maybe I'm getting it a little bit confused.
Yeah, no, it's not XXE. It's different technology. Like, web stacks have changed so much since time. Like, this is something, there you go, like, it kind of looks like an HTML comment. The directive parameter value, like, kind of doing that for general SI, so you can do this in your HTML. You could do this include. And the server, which I'm not sure which servers still support it. Yeah, it looks like it is generally supported. Probably have to enable it still, but it's not something that's used too often anymore. Like, this is something, you know, in 2002, you don't want to run like PHP, which was super popular at the time. You don't want to run something like that. But you do want to include pages and kind of have some separation in your code, in your HTML. So you might do an SSI include. And there are attacks that you can do if you're able to control values being included. Or if you can inject like the SSI tags into something. There's a few different things, but either way, SSI is quite old. My assumption here is because of how few websites would still be using SSI, Cloudflare just doesn't even do the checks for it.
Yeah, and I think the fact that people get it confused or like don't even know exactly what it is just highlights how uncommon it is.
Yeah, well, what had happened on Reddit was somebody had called it out as being like, oh, well, if you don't even know what SSL is, because they read that as being SSL, not SSI, and kind of had their comment about not even knowing that, where it's like, nope, this is SSI, this is something, and, you know, Hack This Site still has it on there, but Hack This Site was created in, 2003, I want to say? Maybe 4,
the dark
I think
times.
3. It was a while ago, put simply, and, like, SSI was still, injections there was still a thing. I've never seen it in, like, professionally speaking, I never saw anybody using it. I have seen it used, like, says, as a teenager, I had seen it a couple times.
Did you ever use it?
No. Maybe once, actually. I think I might have just tried it locally when I was playing around with exploiting it.
Oh, okay.
But not for anything of value.
Yeah. So obviously the test results are like the big thing of the blog post. That's like the highlight of it. They also talked about some conclusions they came out of testing with, though. One was that URL encoding affected the performance of web application firewalls across the board. Attacks with encoded URLs were generally more successful, which I guess kind of makes sense. It's just missed in the WAF. They're just not decoding the URL. I don't know if that's like a performance trade-off thing or if it's just something that was missed in some of them, but that's a pretty cool conclusion that came out of it. Generally, I like this kind of research that compares to different technologies to test the effectiveness. I think they offer useful insight even to non-security people who just want to evaluate like which solution is the best for them. It offers some useful insights and conclusions, like the one with the URL encoding, for example. One thing I did want to note about their test, though, that I found a little bit weird, is they have a vast difference in number of test cases ran for each category. So path traversal, for example, they had 9,000 test cases ran, where XSS only had 300. Now, you have a very vast difference between some of the categories and how much they were tested. So you are going to want to factor that into some of the results, because while they ran the same number of tests for each web application firewall in that category, it shows that some of the groups are going to have inflated numbers with the lower amount of test cases, or deflated, depending on how well they did. So it's probably a little bit less accurate than it could have been. I don't know why they didn't try to match up the test case count more closely. I mean,
at the same time, because
exact, but
because these are different attacks, different techniques that could be used there. Does it really matter if there's 200 different ways of doing like cross-site scripting versus sorry, it just looked like I had been dropping some video there, so I apologize if something cut out, but I don't think that test case, like, I do think like 9,000 is quite a bit for path traversal, but it kind of comes down to how many different ways you can attack something too. Like, I mean, sure, in theory, you've got unlimited ways to attack something, but I don't know. I feel like that would be arbitrary to be requesting that, okay, so you need, 500 XSS attempts and 500 SQL injection. And then you need also 500 of whatever other like server-side include injections.
No, see, I'm not saying that they should be equal, but I'm just saying there is like a sample size bias potentially in there that you might want to,
yeah, okay, that's fair. There might be a bias there, especially if you have a lot of test cases that end up repeating the same sort of test. Then, one thing that doesn't track, it's going to fail all of those. And if they don't have those balanced out, that can definitely kind of cause problems with the numbers.
Yeah. Generally, though, I don't see any issue with the test results. Though I didn't think about what you were saying about how you kind of want to check the other side too, because you don't want to be overly aggressively like blocking. So that could be kind of like a nice next step, is to test these web application firewalls, maybe with the same, I don't know, like I would want to see how often it's falsely doing that with false positives. So maybe
so I would just want test cases. Well, so I would imagine just innocuous test cases that aren't doing command injection at all, that aren't doing anything whatsoever.
Those are going to be harder to generate, though. That's the only thing.
Well, you can, in theory, just do random data.
You could.
That probably won't be the best test. Yeah, there's definitely some questions on how you do the testing, but I do think that would be interesting to see, to try and see false positives. And in the real world, I mean, where you're running it kind of matters too. Like, you're going to have more false positives on, say, a hacking form, where people are talking about things attacked. Well, not even trying it, because trying it isn't a false positive. That should be blocked. But who are going to be talking about it, so are going to include those tokens or those little words that get caught up.
Yeah. So yeah, that would be a nice next step, is just to see if you could measure false positives as well. But I don't begrudge them for not doing that. That is like a whole nother can of worms, kind of. So DoyenSec put out a article on fuzzing TLS certificates from their ASN1 grammar. So TLS certificates, they use this grammar. I haven't heard of it before, but this post basically describes that grammar as like an old version of protobufs for like serialization and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's the summary of it. I mean, basically it's just a definition, or as you say, a grammar. Contains several different types there, as they show the example there of like an integer UTF-8 string, and you can just define exactly what your object is. So for TLS certificates, X, 509, 508, whatever the number is, the RFCs define the ASN1 of what that should look like. And there are other protocols that use it, other things that use it too. ASN1 is pretty widely used, actually. Just in a lot of kind of older tech in the background rather than, it's, but definitely anywhere you have like certificates is almost certainly has an ASN1 for it. So the idea here, it mentions fuzzing TLS certificates, but what they actually go about doing is building a fuzzer that will take ASN1 as input and output fuzzing and generate your tests based on ASN.
Yeah. So this grammar, like the first example they give here, like the one you were talking about with the integer to the UTF-8 string, that one is pretty simple, but they note that the grammar can get super complex. They note that it has like 13 different string types. You can add field constraints. You can have information objects, parameterization, templating. You can insert that meme here. I heard you like grammars, so I gave you grammars that you can use in your grammars. But like, so they show here, like, when you have such complex grammars like that, it's going to be an interesting target for fuzzing because of how many different possibilities there are and how many edge cases there could be by extension of that. So they show here how they compile the grammar to generate random abstract syntax trees to provide for smart fuzzing TLS certs, or anything that uses ASN1, I guess. So this post is more of an early stage type of research post. There's no results yet. They say that's coming in a future blog post. There's also no source code for what they're doing, but again, that is another thing that they're planning to open source in the future. So
yeah, I really think they should just have released that. If they're releasing this is like a teaser, then like putting it out there, the code's research quality, so we're not putting it out there. Honestly, even research quality code, you just put it out there and say it's research quality. It'll be updated. Yeah, it'll be updated. I guess you do run the challenge of you put it out there and the community runs with it before you put your proper version out. But still, I'd have kind of preferred it if it was released with the post, but I still kind of want to call this out anyhow.
Yeah.
It's definitely an interesting approach to try.
It's something to keep an eye on, and it's not something I can ever recall really seeing being targeted from a fuzzing perspective before.
No, like certificates are targeted for sure, but going from ASN1 to the fuzzing generation, that's
like, I haven't seen that part before. So I think we will probably see some interesting results when those get put out there. So it might be something we can try to cover on a future episode. You watch, it'll probably happen when we're taking the break. So we'll probably have to cover it after we come back from the break or something. But it's something that I'll keep bookmarked. We'll say that. So we're gonna cap off the show with a shout out. This was kind of a last minute addition that I saw right before we started the podcast today. And it's the CISA, the Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It's a real mouthful. Easier to just say CISA. And the FBI put out this article that talks about the top 10 most exploited vulnerabilities. And the list is actually kind of interesting. As the bait headline would go, the results will shock you in a little bit. Or at least they shocked me.
No, number 3 will shock you. I have no idea what number 3 is.
That's what it is. What I found kind of weird about it was basically all of the products that CVEs were listed for were like products I wouldn't expect. They were like Microsoft Office, Apache struts, Adobe
Why wouldn't
Flash
you expect
Player,
Office? So it looks like... This is my first time looking at this since, like Spectre mentioned, it was added more or less last minute. So I'm assuming the very first one, like this isn't in like the reverse order, like a countdown. So I'm assuming Office is the most exploited. So you were saying you wouldn't have expected that, whereas I think it's obvious that stuff like Office or is Adobe in here too. Like I'd expect those Office tools to kind of be compromised because that's part of that comes down, you phish somebody to open up, or social engineer, I should say, somebody to open up your doc file. It's very easy to get that done in a lot of environments, and you can get a lot of access through like a secretary's computer or something like that. So it seems to me like something like Office would be heavily exploited, and I'm constantly hearing about issues there. So, I'm not surprised by that, but I'm curious why you are.
I guess part of the reason I'm surprised by it is, for one, I don't know if this is just a bias from like just me not being like around a business environment super often, but Office doesn't really. It seems to be falling out of favor a little bit, and what I mean by that is, with the rise of things like the Google Cloud, like Google Docs and stuff like that, it seems like companies aren't really using Microsoft Office. Like some of the companies that I've worked at haven't even really used it, and so I thought its usage was kind of falling off. And the other thing was, I would expect that there would be what I expected with top 10 most exploited vulnerabilities were stuff like, let's say, browser bugs, like drive-bys and stuff like that, that could easily, like, quickly deliver malware. Like, yes, that is technically, or that is usually used for like more targeted attacks as well. But I don't know. For some reason, I just didn't really expect Office to be on the list as much as it is. Like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think six of the top 10 were all in Office, and then you had a few in like Adobe, Flash Player, which again is something that isn't really used anymore, but it was used a lot in the past. So it's probably inflated by that. And then like Drupal and stuff like that. Like I don't know. I just expected, I guess, some more like browser stuff and stuff like that in there, but maybe that's just a bias from like that's what I'm interested in. Maybe.
Yeah, it could be a bias from collection information too. There's a lot of ways that can be biased. I don't know how they found things, but oh no, I mean this does mention actually malware specifically. So this could be post drop. Oh no, that wouldn't make sense for it to be post drop.
I never even noticed, by the way. That's cool. I didn't notice that they attached like associated malware that used those bugs to them. That's really cool. Because I was thinking it would be cool if we had Anti on so we could ask him if he's like seen some of these things, but I didn't notice right in there they put associated malware, so that's really cool. But yeah, I don't know. The list just surprised me, but I think this list might be interesting to people out there. It's also interesting that pretty much all the CVEs on this list are from 2017. So these are the top 10 most exploited vulnerabilities from 2016 to 2019. So anything before 2016 isn't in the list. I guess it kind of makes sense that 2017 is in the list the most because unless people are staying up to date really often, which with something like Microsoft Office probably, I don't know how common updating is to like the latest security fixes and stuff. So it's probably a lot more likely to be able to hit people with end days and stuff like that, which is probably why you see some of the older CVEs.
I mean, there is Office 365 to kind of make that a little bit easier now.
Yeah.
That's a Drugi mentions. Oh no, feel like you're completely ignoring all the corporate targets. Probably the most obvious way for somebody to compromise an org via malicious docs. And yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at when I said I wasn't too surprised by it. And yeah, I do think that is. I mean, Spectre, you mentioned that's probably your bias of not being in too many Office environments, but it's still very, very heavily used.
Well, here would be my other question then, and this is now I'm wishing Andy was on here again, is how often are corporations and like organizations targeted compared to just like everyday people? Because most everyday people, if they're not doing office, like professional office work or anything like that, they're not going to have Office installed on their PC. If they get an email with a docx file, they're probably not even going to be able to open it, or if they do, it's just going to open in like Notepad or something. You know what I mean? Like that's why I was kind of wondering is how much is malware targeting corporate entities compared to home users?
I feel like corporate. I guess I can't really say. Yeah, Antti would know more on that. Unfortunately, he isn't on, so you'll have to make do with my speculation. I'd say there's a good chance corporations are getting a lot more heavily targeted. Well, there are some things that will just kind of target at large.
That's what I was thinking. Like, try to hit everything possible, which corporations might get swept up in that, but generally, like, I wonder how much corporations specifically are getting targeted by.
Well, malware. I would imagine. That comes down to whether or not it's a targeted attack or not. That said, I don't know enough about the stats to make an intelligent speculation there. I don't see why they wouldn't and why something wouldn't use the docs like Drugi kind of mentioned. It's one of the easiest ways to compromise an organization is through malicious docs. So, like, it really doesn't surprise me at all, but I don't have stats to back that up.
Yeah. So I guess that was just kind of explaining a little bit why I was a bit surprised. But yeah. Anyway, that list is out there. You can check it out. Might be an interesting read for some of you, but we just wanted to add that as a shout out because, like we said, last minute edition, and people might find it interesting. That being said, that's all the topics for today. I don't know if you have any parting notes before we jump off. See, yeah, I don't think I have any really either, other than the fact that next week is going to be our last episode until September 14th. So that's going to be our, episode 43 is going to be the last one for a few months. So just keep that in mind. That being said, all of our past episodes, including this one 24 hours from now, is going to be on YouTube. You can also find it in Twitch VODs or on, what's that, the Anchor? I sometimes I forget the name. It's also on Anchor. All of the links are on there. It's
Anchor
on Spotify,
has most of our links. I guess exactly. JDog does ask, what are you guys doing during your summer break? Vacation, projects, work? Question mark there. Not stating that that's what we'll be doing.
Probably all three in my case.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah,
it's a mix of those. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm going up north for a little bit. Up north, I'm probably going to be working on projects and more like professional related projects. So yeah, all three of them for me.
Yeah, and I'll probably head off hiking somewhere. I
Probably
do some long
US
distance hiking, so if the border opens, I still might head up to the Arctic, up in Alaska again, but that's only if the border opens. I think I can be pretty socially distanced in the Arctic.
I don't know, man. That's a pretty popular place this time of year. But yeah, so Z's going to be doing hiking. I'm going to be going up north and working on projects. But yeah, so you can catch all the past episodes on our Twitch, on the Anchor, has all the links as well. You can get involved in the community as well. Even though we're not going to be doing podcast episodes during those few months we're going to be off, we're still going to be on Discord and stuff. We're not going to fall off, go off the grid or anything like that. So if you join our Discord, we'll still be talking in there. So you can feel free to join in there if you want something to kind of fill the gap. We also might do streams and stuff like that, and we'll put out alerts when we do stuff like that on Twitter, so you can follow us on there as well. Other than that, though, we will see you guys next Monday for the last episode of our podcast for the break. See you guys then.